The Doomsday Argument. According to mathematics, humanity is likely in its final hours, and your existence is the evidence. This isn't religious prophecy or environmental alarmism, it's pure probability, and it's possibly the most disturbing calculation ever made. The Doomsday Argument suggests that the mere fact you're alive right now is statistical evidence that humanity is approaching extinction. And the more you understand it, the harder it becomes to find the flaw in its reasoning. Imagine randomly selecting a human from all humans who will ever exist, past, present, and future. What are the odds you'd pick someone alive today? If humanity continues for millions of years, with trillions more humans yet to be born, the chances would be astronomically small. Yet here you are, existing right now. According to the Doomsday Argument, this is like drawing a numbered ball from a cosmic lottery and getting a very low number. And that suggests there may not be many more numbers left to draw. This isn't fringe pseudoscience. It was formalized by Princeton physicist Brandon Carter and later developed by philosophers like John Leslie and Nick Bostrom. The mathematics behind it is surprisingly straightforward, yet its implications are profound enough to have troubled some of the greatest minds in contemporary philosophy. Let's break it down. Imagine humanity as a book with each human life as a page. If you were to randomly open this book, it would be extraordinarily unlikely to open it to one of the very first pages. Similarly, it would be unlikely to open it to one of the very last pages. Most likely, you'd open it somewhere in the middle. Now consider that approximately 100 billion humans have lived throughout our entire history, with about 8 billion alive today. If you are a random human in the timeline of our species, you're most likely to be somewhere around the middle of our story, not at the beginning and not at the very end. But here's where it gets disturbing. If humanity were to continue for millions more years, colonizing other planets, spreading throughout the galaxy, the total number of humans who will ever exist could easily reach into the trillions. In that scenario, we current humans would represent less than 1% of all humans who will ever live. We would be the earliest chapters of a vast human story. So why are you alive now instead of in that distant future? The Doomsday Argument suggests a chilling answer. Because that future doesn't exist. The reason you find yourself alive during this period of history, rather than in the far future, is that there won't be a far future, at least not one filled with trillions of humans. The counter-argument many immediately reach for is known as the self-sampling assumption objection. You might say, well, of course I find myself alive now. When else would I be alive? But this misses the point. The question isn't why you specifically exist now rather than later. It's about why your consciousness is attached to a body that exists at this particular time in human history, rather than at some other time. If we accept that your birth rank in human history is effectively random, that is, you were equally likely to be the 1 billionth human or the 500 billionth, then finding yourself so early in what could be a much longer timeline becomes increasingly improbable. It's like reaching into a jar containing 1,000,000 numbered balls and pulling out number 427. You'd immediately suspect there aren't really 1,000,000 balls in that jar. The philosopher John Leslie illustrated this with what's called the shooting room thought experiment. Imagine you're placed in a room where a coin is flipped. If it lands tails, 10 people are brought into the room and 1 is shot. If it lands heads, 100 people are brought in and 1 is shot. If it lands heads again, 1,000 people come in, and so on. If you find yourself in this room with only 10 people, it suggests the coin probably landed tails. Finding yourself among a smaller group is evidence that the larger groups probably don't exist. Similarly, finding yourself among the first few 100 billion humans suggests that the trillions of future humans may never exist. And the mechanism for their non-existence? Some existential catastrophe that either wipes out humanity entirely or reduces our numbers so drastically that we never reach those larger population figures. What makes the Doomsday Argument particularly unsettling is that it doesn't rely on any specific threat. It doesn't point to nuclear war, climate change, pandemic, asteroid impact, or artificial intelligence as the likely cause of our demise. It simply says that, statistically speaking, we should expect our end to come sooner rather than later. The specific mechanism is irrelevant to the mathematics. But surely there must be some flaw in this reasoning. Many brilliant minds have tried to find one. Some argue that the argument makes an unfounded assumption about the randomness of birth rank. Others invoke the anthropic principle, suggesting that we can only observe universes compatible with our existence. One intriguing counter is the self-indication assumption, which suggests that when considering your place in possible worlds, you should give more weight to worlds with more observers. In other words, the very fact that you exist at all makes it more likely that you exist in a world with many observers rather than few. This would counteract the doomsday argument by suggesting that your existence actually makes it more likely that humanity has a long future ahead. Another approach questions whether we can legitimately consider ourselves random humans in the total set of all humans who will ever exist. After all, we aren't randomly selected from that set. We exist at a particular time for specific historical reasons. This objection suggests that the doomsday argument commits a kind of sample bias by treating our perspective as if it were randomly chosen when it actually isn't. Despite these counter-arguments, the doomsday argument retains a troubling resilience. Even its strongest critics acknowledge that it's not easily dismissed. Nick Bostrom, who has written extensively on existential risks, considers it a serious philosophical problem, even though he doesn't believe it definitively proves our imminent extinction. What makes this paradox particularly relevant today is that we do face unprecedented existential threats. Nuclear arsenals still contain enough warheads to end civilization. Climate change threatens to make large portions of the planet uninhabitable. Engineered pandemics could be far deadlier than natural ones. And emerging technologies like artificial general intelligence introduce risks we barely understand. The doomsday argument doesn't tell us which of these threats might be our undoing. It simply suggests that the odds of human extinction in the relatively near future are higher than we intuitively think. And perhaps that's its greatest value, not as a prediction of doom, but as a call to take existential risks seriously. If there's even a small chance that the argument is correct, it dramatically raises the stakes of our current actions. Decisions we make today about technology, environment, and global cooperation might determine whether humanity has a long future or barely any future at all. The existence of future generations, potentially trillions of lives, hangs in the balance. This perspective has given rise to a philosophical approach called long-termism, which holds that positively influencing the long-term future is a key moral priority of our time. Organizations like the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University are dedicated to understanding and mitigating threats to humanity's long-term survival. But there's another possibility, one rarely discussed in academic treatments of the topic. What if the doomsday argument isn't warning us about human extinction, but about a transformation so profound that beings recognizable as human no longer dominate Earth's future? If artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, or mind uploading fundamentally change what it means to be human, the era of Homo sapiens as we understand ourselves might indeed be approaching its end, not through catastrophe, but through metamorphosis. In this light, the doomsday argument might not be predicting our extinction, but our evolution into something else entirely. The 100 billion humans who have lived so far might indeed represent a significant fraction of all humans who will ever exist as humans. But our descendants might continue in forms we would barely recognize. The doomsday argument confronts us with the possibility of an imminent end, but it also places us at a unique moment of responsibility. Of all the countless humans who have ever lived, we happen to be alive at a time when we have both the awareness of existential risk and the technological capability to address it. Perhaps that's not coincidence but necessity. Perhaps every technological civilization must pass through this narrow gate of existential awareness, where it either learns to manage its own power or succumbs to it. Whether we face extinction, transformation, or some combination of both, the doomsday argument forces us to confront the fragility and preciousness of human existence. It suggests that we may not have the luxury of countless generations to solve our problems or fulfill our potential. So the next time you contemplate humanity's future among the stars, spreading through the galaxy over millions of years, Remember the mathematical shadow cast by the doomsday argument. Remember that your very existence at this time in history provides evidence against that expansive future, and then decide whether to accept that statistical verdict or to dedicate yourself to proving it wrong. Quantum immortality. What if death is something you can never experience? Not because of an afterlife, but because your consciousness only continues in realities where you survive. According to quantum mechanics, there might be versions of you dying constantly, yet from your perspective, you'd always beat the odds. This isn't spiritual, it's physics, and it's making scientists question the nature of consciousness itself. Imagine a physicist who decides to test the most disturbing thought experiment in quantum mechanics. She sits in a sealed room with a quantum measurement device connected to a gun pointed at her head. Each time the device measures a quantum particle, there's a 50% chance it will fire the gun. She begins the experiment, and the trigger is pulled. From an outside observer's perspective, there's a 50% chance she's now dead. But from her perspective, she can only experience the outcome where she survives. She repeats the experiment 10 times in a row. The odds of surviving all 10 trials are less than 1 in 1,000. Yet from her subjective viewpoint, she experiences an incredible streak of luck, because in any reality where she died, her consciousness ceased to exist in that branch. This is the quantum suicide thought experiment, and it leads to the bizarre notion of quantum immortality, the idea that from your own first-person perspective, you might never experience death. It's not that you don't die, it's that your consciousness only follows the branches of reality where you survive. To understand this paradox, we need to grasp the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. According to this theory, every time a quantum event has multiple possible outcomes, reality splits into separate branches, one for each possibility. When scientists measure a particle that could be in multiple states, the universe doesn't collapse into one outcome. Instead, it branches into multiple realities, each containing one possible result. The implications are staggering. Every quantum event, and there are countless such events happening every second, creates new branches. This means there are infinite versions of you experiencing slightly different realities. In some, you died years ago in an accident. In others, you're reading this exact sentence right now. What quantum immortality suggests is that your conscious experience can only follow the branches where you remain alive. In branches where you die, there is no consciousness to experience that death. Your subjective experience therefore becomes an endless journey through the branches where you survive, no matter how improbable those survivals might be. Consider a car accident. A truck is about to hit you head-on. In most branches of reality, you die instantly. But perhaps in 1 in a billion branches, something miraculous happens. The truck swerves at the last moment, or physics behaves in some extraordinarily unlikely way that spares your life. According to quantum immortality, your consciousness can only continue along that 1 in a billion path. From your perspective, you experience an incredible near miss, while from the outside, most observers in most branches of reality attend your funeral. As you age, the branches where you survive would become increasingly improbable. Perhaps your consciousness would find itself in realities where medical technology advances rapidly enough to extend your life. Or maybe you'd experience seemingly miraculous recoveries from illnesses that should have been fatal. From the outside, each of these events would look like extraordinary luck. From the inside, they would be the only possible experiences you could have. This concept has troubled philosophers and physicists alike. If true, it would mean that subjectively, each of us is immortal, not in a spiritual sense, but in the cold, mathematical reality of quantum mechanics. It would mean that anyone reading this will never experience their own death, only increasingly improbable survivals. But there are profound problems with this view. For one, it seems to create a division between what we might call objective reality and subjective experience. In objective reality, the full multiverse of all branches, you still die in most branches. It's only your subjective thread of consciousness that continues indefinitely. There's also the question of consciousness itself. What exactly is this observer that travels only along the branches where survival occurs? Is consciousness truly binary, either fully present or entirely absent? What about cases of brain damage or dementia where consciousness appears to exist on a spectrum? In branches where you survive with severe brain injuries, is that still you experiencing that reality? The paradox gets even stranger when we consider what happens as you age. Eventually, the probability of your survival would become vanishingly small. Perhaps your consciousness would find itself in increasingly bizarre branches of reality, ones where science has conquered aging, or where the laws of physics behave in ways that allow your continued existence. Your subjective experience might become increasingly detached from what most would consider normal reality. Some philosophers argue that quantum immortality misunderstands the relationship between consciousness and physics. They suggest that consciousness isn't something that travels between branches, but is rather a property that emerges in each branch independently. In this view, the version of you that survives in one branch has no privileged connection to the version that died in another. They're simply different people with shared memories up to the point of branching. Others point out that quantum mechanics might not actually work the way the many worlds interpretation suggests. There are competing interpretations of quantum physics, many of which don't involve branching realities at all. Without this branching, the foundation of quantum immortality collapses. Yet the idea persists, in part because it touches on our deepest fears and hopes about mortality. It offers a kind of cold comfort, not the warm embrace of a religious afterlife, but the sterile immortality of mathematics and physics. It suggests that while death is real and happens in most branches of reality, your subjective experience continues indefinitely. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of quantum immortality is what it would actually feel like to experience it. As you age, the branches where you survive would become increasingly improbable and potentially increasingly unpleasant. You might find yourself surviving, but in states of declining health or in medical scenarios that prolong life without quality. The theory suggests you would subjectively experience being the oldest person alive, then the oldest person who has ever lived, and then something beyond current human understanding. This has led some philosophers to call quantum immortality a kind of curse rather than a blessing. In this view, we should actually hope that the theory is wrong, that consciousness does terminate at death, rather than continuing through increasingly improbable and potentially unpleasant branches of survival. There's also the question of identity over time. If your consciousness continues through increasingly improbable branches, at what point would the you that continues no longer meaningfully connect to the you that exists now? If you survive for thousands of years through various medical technologies, uploading to computers, or other speculative means, would that still be you in any meaningful sense? The quantum immortality paradox sits at the intersection of physics, philosophy, and our deepest existential questions. It takes the mathematics of quantum mechanics to their logical extreme and asks what they mean for our subjective experience of life and death. The answer it provides is both tantalizing and terrifying. From your perspective, you may never experience death, only an endless stream of increasingly improbable survivals. Whether this is true remains unknown and perhaps unknowable. We cannot peer into other branches of reality if they exist, nor can we follow our consciousness beyond the point of death to see if it continues elsewhere. But the very possibility forces us to reconsider what we think we know about consciousness, identity, and mortality. So the next time you narrowly avoid an accident or recover from a serious illness, consider this unsettling possibility. Perhaps in most branches of reality, you didn't. Perhaps what you're experiencing is just one thread in an infinite tapestry of possibilities, the only thread your consciousness could possibly follow. We live, we die, but perhaps we only experience the living. The dying happens to other versions of ourselves, in branches of reality forever closed to our experience. Quantum immortality doesn't promise an afterlife. It promises an eternal series of narrow escapes, a consciousness that subjectively cannot experience its own termination. Whether this is liberation or nightmare depends entirely on your perspective. Either way, it challenges our most fundamental understanding of what it means to be and what it means to cease to be. The Sleeping Beauty problem. A simple probability question has created a bitter divide among the world's top mathematicians for decades. Some insist the answer is 1/2. Others are equally certain it's 1/3. Both sides have rigorous proofs. This isn't opinion. It's a fundamental crack in the foundation of probability theory that suggests our understanding of uncertainty might be deeply flawed. Here's the scenario. Sleeping Beauty volunteers for an experiment. On Sunday, she's given a drug that puts her to sleep. A fair coin is then flipped. If it lands heads, she'll be awakened once on Monday and then sent home. If it lands tails, she'll be awakened on Monday, but then given another drug that makes her forget this awakening, and she'll be awakened again on Tuesday before being sent home. Crucially, when she wakes up, she won't know what day it is or whether she's been awakened before. The question: when Sleeping Beauty wakes up, what probability should she assign to the coin having landed heads? This deceptively simple problem has split probability theorists into two warring camps: halfers and thirders. The halfers argue the answer is 1/2. The thirders insist it's 1/3. And despite decades of debate, there's still no consensus, a deeply unsettling reality for a field built on mathematical certainty. Let's start with the halfer position. They argue that Sleeping Beauty gains no new information about the coin when she wakes up. The coin was fair, so the probability was 1/2 before the experiment began. Nothing about waking up tells her anything about how the coin landed. She'll wake up regardless. Without new information about the coin, the probability remains 1/2. The thirder position counters with this argument. Consider the experiment from the perspective of awakening events. There are 3 possible awakening scenarios. 1. Monday awakening after heads. 2. Monday awakening after tails. And 3. Tuesday awakening after tails. These 3 awakenings are equally likely from Sleeping Beauty's perspective when she wakes up, since she can't distinguish between them. Since only one of these 3 scenarios involves the coin landing heads, the probability is 1/3. Both arguments seem impeccably logical. Both lead to contradictory conclusions. This isn't a matter of mathematical error. It's something more fundamental and disturbing. The problem cuts to the heart of how we understand probability. Are we talking about the chance of an event occurring in the world, the coin landing heads? Or are we talking about the rational degree of belief a person should have given their information, Sleeping Beauty's credence upon awakening? These two notions of probability, often called objective and subjective, don't always align in this problem. The debate gets even more complex when we consider variations. What if Sleeping Beauty is awakened 1 million times after tails instead of just twice? The halfer position seems increasingly counterintuitive. Would she really still believe the probability is 1/2 despite potentially experiencing 1 million awakenings? Yet the core halfer argument remains mathematically sound. Some philosophers have suggested that the problem reveals something profound about self-locating beliefs, beliefs about where you are in time and space. When Sleeping Beauty wakes up, she knows she exists, but she doesn't know when she exists. This type of uncertainty might operate differently than our uncertainty about external events like coin flips. Others argue that the problem reveals the limitations of our traditional probability framework. Perhaps we need new mathematical tools that can better handle these scenarios involving memory loss and multiple possible locations in time. The disagreement extends beyond mathematics into philosophy of mind and metaphysics. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to be the same person across time, especially when memories are artificially manipulated? Is the Sleeping Beauty who wakes on Monday after tails the same person as the one who wakes on Tuesday, given that their mental states are identical? What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is that probability theory underlies much of modern science, economics, and decision-making. If brilliant mathematicians can't agree on the answer to such a simple problem, what does that say about our ability to quantify uncertainty in more complex, real-world scenarios? The problem has practical implications too. Consider medical decision-making when patients have memory impairments or artificial intelligence systems that might be duplicated across multiple environments. How should these entities assess probabilities when they don't know which copy they are? Some have tried to resolve the paradox by suggesting that both answers are correct in different contexts. Maybe one half is the right answer when considering the objective chance of the coin landing heads, while 1/3 correctly represents Sleeping Beauty's subjective credence upon awakening. But this solution doesn't satisfy everyone, as it suggests probability might not be as universal or objective as we'd like to believe. Another approach suggests that probability theory needs to be expanded to include a formal treatment of self-locating beliefs. Perhaps we need different mathematical frameworks for different types of uncertainty. One for uncertainty about the external world, like coin flips, and another for uncertainty about one's location within a given world. The disagreement has grown so entrenched that it's become more than just an academic dispute. It's developed into something resembling philosophical tribalism. Respected mathematicians and philosophers identify as either halfers or thirders, with each camp viewing the other with a mixture of bafflement and frustration. How can such smart people be so wrong about something so fundamental? This tribal division points to something important. The problem might not be purely mathematical. It may involve deeply held intuitions about identity, consciousness, and rationality that extend beyond formal probability theory. When we ask about the correct probability, we're also asking deeper questions about what it means to be a rational agent navigating an uncertain world with imperfect information about one's own position in time. The Sleeping Beauty problem also connects to puzzles in decision theory. How should she bet if offered a wager on the coin's outcome when she wakes up? Should she use the 1/2 or 1/3 probability in calculating expected values? Depending on which approach she takes, she might make different decisions, a troubling prospect for those who believe rationality should yield consistent choices. Some have even suggested that the paradox reveals limitations in our understanding of consciousness and its relationship to probability. If Sleeping Beauty's consciousness jumps between Monday and Tuesday in the tails scenario, how should this affect her credences? Does consciousness itself play a role in how we should reason about uncertainty? What started as a simple probability puzzle has exploded into a profound challenge to our understanding of rationality, identity, and uncertainty. It suggests that even in domains we consider most certain, like mathematics, there may be fundamental limitations to our knowledge. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Sleeping Beauty problem is that it forces us to confront the possibility that probability, the very framework we use to quantify uncertainty, may itself be fundamentally uncertain. If we can't agree on the probability in this simple scenario, what hope do we have for agreement in the far more complex uncertainties we face in the real world? So the next time you confidently assert that something has a 50% chance of happening, remember Sleeping Beauty. In her paradox, we find a humbling reminder that even our most basic tools for understanding uncertainty may be more uncertain than we'd like to admit. The dividing line between 1/2 and 1/3 isn't just a mathematical curiosity. It's a crack in the foundation of rationality itself, a glimpse into the limits of human understanding, and a reminder that sometimes the deepest insights come not from resolving paradoxes, but from embracing their uncomfortable implications. The problem of evil. If an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God exists, why does suffering exist? This isn't just a question for the religious. It's a logical puzzle that has challenged philosophy for thousands of years. The most brilliant theological minds have attempted solutions, yet none have fully resolved the contradiction that sits at the heart of how we understand the divine. A child prays for her dying brother. An earthquake orphans thousands. A tsunami wipes out entire communities. These tragedies pose a devastating logical problem for monotheistic religions. If God is omnipotent, all-powerful, then he can prevent all suffering. If God is omniscient, all-knowing, then he knows about all suffering. If God is omnibenevolent, all-loving, then he wants to prevent all suffering. Yet suffering plainly exists. These four statements form a contradiction. They cannot all be true simultaneously. This is the problem of evil, first articulated by Epicurus in ancient Greece and later formalized by philosophers like David Hume. It's perhaps the most compelling argument against the existence of God as traditionally conceived in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The challenge is simple but profound. Either God cannot prevent suffering, so he isn't all-powerful, doesn't know about all suffering, so he isn't all-knowing, doesn't want to prevent all suffering, so he isn't all-loving, or simply doesn't exist. Religious thinkers have grappled with this paradox for millennia, developing elaborate theodicies, defenses of God's goodness in the face of evil. Let's examine the most influential attempts to resolve this paradox and why each ultimately falls short of a complete solution. The first major approach is the free will defense, most famously articulated by philosopher Alvin Plantinga. This argument suggests that God values human freedom so highly that he permits evil as a necessary consequence of that freedom. A world with free beings who sometimes choose evil is more valuable than a world of automatons who always do good. When humans commit atrocities, they're exercising the very freedom that makes them human. But this defense has serious limitations. It might explain human-caused suffering, but what about natural disasters, childhood diseases, or animal suffering? When a tsunami kills thousands, no human freedom is involved. Furthermore, could an omnipotent God not create beings with free will who always freely choose good? The Christian tradition itself suggests this is possible. Angels and saints in heaven have free will yet don't sin. Another approach is the soul-making theodicy, developed by theologian John Hick. This view argues that suffering serves as a spiritual gymnasium, developing virtues that couldn't exist otherwise. Courage makes no sense without danger. Compassion requires suffering to alleviate. Perseverance needs adversity to overcome. God permits evil because he wants us to develop these character qualities. Critics point out the disproportionate nature of suffering in our world. Does a child dying of cancer really need that particular soul-making experience? Why do some people face minimal hardship while others endure unimaginable torment? The distribution of suffering seems arbitrary, rather than carefully calibrated for spiritual growth. A third approach is the greater good defense, which suggests that God permits suffering because it enables greater goods that couldn't be achieved otherwise. Perhaps events that appear evil from our limited perspective serve purposes we can't comprehend, like a child who doesn't understand why a painful vaccination is necessary. But this solution creates its own problems. If God is truly omnipotent, why would he be constrained by such trade-offs? Couldn't an all-powerful being achieve these greater goods without the corresponding evils? And if we argue that even God is bound by logical necessity, we've already limited divine omnipotence in significant ways. Some theologians turn to what's called skeptical theism, the view that human cognitive limitations prevent us from understanding God's reasons for permitting evil. Just as a dog cannot grasp calculus, perhaps humans cannot comprehend the divine calculus of good and evil. Who are we to judge God with our limited perspective? This approach essentially waves a white flag of intellectual surrender. While it acknowledges the importance of epistemic humility, it also undermines all human moral reasoning. If we can't trust our moral intuition that gratuitous suffering is wrong, how can we trust our intuition that God is good in the first place? Skeptical theism risks making God's goodness meaningless. Eastern religious traditions offer different approaches. Buddhism sidesteps the problem by not positing an omnipotent creator God, instead seeing suffering as the inevitable result of attachment and craving. Hinduism's concept of karma explains suffering as the consequence of actions in past lives, though this raises questions about the justice of suffering we have no memory of causing. In Jewish thought, there's a tradition of arguing with God, from Abraham bargaining over Sodom and Gomorrah to Job questioning divine justice. These traditions acknowledge the paradox without necessarily resolving it, suggesting that wrestling with the contradiction might itself be spiritually valuable. Modern philosophers have pushed the paradox further. The sheer quantity of suffering in the world seems excessive for any divine purpose. As philosopher William Rowe asked, when a fawn burns to death in a forest fire, suffering in agony with no human witness, what possible divine purpose could that serve? The most sophisticated contemporary theistic response comes from skeptical theism, combined with a multiverse theory. Perhaps our universe, with all its suffering, is just one of many possible worlds God has created, and its existence contributes to the maximum possible diversity and goodness across all creation. But this speculative metaphysics raises as many questions as it answers. What makes the problem of evil particularly devastating is that it uses religion's own premises against it. It doesn't deny God outright. It shows that the traditional divine attributes, when combined with the empirical fact of suffering, lead to contradiction. Any resolution requires modifying one of these attributes, effectively redefining what God means. Some theologians have taken exactly this approach. Process theology limits God's power, suggesting that God persuades rather than controls creation. Open theism limits God's knowledge of the future. Others reinterpret God's goodness to be compatible with permitting evil for reasons beyond human comprehension. Yet each of these theological moves comes with significant costs. A God who isn't fully omnipotent or omniscient looks suspiciously different from the God described in traditional monotheistic scriptures. And a God whose goodness operates on principles entirely alien to human morality becomes practically indistinguishable from an amoral force. Perhaps the most honest religious response to the problem of evil is simply to acknowledge it as a genuine paradox, a tension that cannot be fully resolved within our current frameworks of understanding. Many thoughtful believers live within this tension, maintaining faith while admitting they don't have satisfactory answers to the problem of suffering. What makes this paradox so powerful and enduring is that it's not merely an abstract philosophical puzzle. It touches the raw nerve of human suffering. When a parent loses a child to cancer, philosophical arguments about free will or soul-making can seem not just inadequate, but almost cruel. The problem of evil is both intellectually challenging and emotionally devastating, and yet, surprisingly, religious belief persists and even thrives in the face of this paradox. Many people find their faith deepened rather than diminished by suffering, turning to God for comfort rather than blaming Him for their pain. The lived experience of faith often transcends the logical contradictions that philosophers identify. This gap between intellectual satisfaction and lived religious experience points to something important. Perhaps the problem of evil reveals the limitations of philosophical theology itself. Maybe the divine, if it exists, simply cannot be captured in the neat logical categories of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. Perhaps the contradiction tells us more about the inadequacy of our concepts than about the existence or non-existence of God. The problem of evil remains unsolved after thousands of years of the most brilliant theological and philosophical minds wrestling with it. This doesn't mean faith is irrational. It means faith requires living with unresolved tension, acknowledging that our understanding is limited and provisional. What's certain is that suffering continues to be the greatest challenge to traditional conceptions of God. As long as children die of cancer, tsunamis destroy communities, and senseless violence persists, the ancient question of Epicurus will continue to haunt religious thought. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then He is not omnipotent. Is He able, but not willing? Then He is malevolent. Is He both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? This is the paradox that has no clean resolution, only various accommodations, each with its own theological costs. Yet in wrestling with this problem, we confront the deepest questions of existence: the nature of good and evil, the limits of human understanding, and what it means to maintain faith in the face of profound suffering. Whether one emerges from this struggle as a believer, an atheist, or something in between, engaging seriously with the problem of evil changes how we see both divinity and humanity. BURIDAN'S bridge. Imagine facing a guardian who will only let you cross a bridge if you correctly predict whether they will let you cross. This impossible logical trap exposes fundamental flaws in how we understand prediction, truth, and self-reference. It's not just a puzzle, it challenges the very foundations of logical reasoning and has serious implications for computer security and artificial intelligence. The scenario sounds simple. You approach a bridge guarded by a sphinx who declares, I will let you cross only if you correctly guess whether I will let you cross or not. This ancient riddle creates an inescapable paradox that has troubled philosophers for centuries and now haunts the cutting edge of artificial intelligence. Let's work through the logical trap. Suppose you guess, you will let me cross. If the Sphinx was planning to let you cross, then your prediction is correct, so she must let you cross. But what if the Sphinx wasn't planning to let you cross? Then your prediction is incorrect, so she must not let you cross. This aligns with her original intention, creating no paradox. Now suppose you guess, you will not let me cross. If the Sphinx wasn't planning to let you cross, then your prediction is correct, so she must let you cross, contradicting her original intention. But if the Sphinx was planning to let you cross, then your prediction is incorrect, so she must not let you cross, again contradicting her original intention. The puzzle becomes truly paradoxical with the second prediction. No matter what the Sphinx originally intended, your prediction, you will not let me cross, creates a logical impossibility. If she wasn't going to let you cross, your correct prediction forces her to let you cross. If she was going to let you cross, your incorrect prediction forces her not to let you cross. Either way, she's trapped in a contradiction. This isn't just a clever word trick. BURIDAN'S bridge reveals something profound about self-referential statements and prediction systems. It creates what logicians call a strange loop, where a system refers back to itself in a way that makes consistent answers impossible. The Sphinx's rule creates an unresolvable circularity, a logical black hole where truth and falsehood collapse. The paradox is named after medieval philosopher Jean Buridan, although similar puzzles appear in ancient traditions. It belongs to the same family as the more famous liar paradox. This statement is false, but with a crucial difference. Buridan's bridge isn't just about abstract logic. It's about prediction, intention, and action. It shows how certain types of predictions can make themselves impossible to resolve. What makes this ancient puzzle suddenly relevant today? We're now building artificial intelligence systems whose job is prediction, predicting what humans want, what will happen next, what decisions to make. And we're discovering that when these systems attempt certain types of self-referential predictions, they can fall into exactly these types of logical traps. Consider an AI tasked with predicting whether it will be shut down. If it predicts it will be shut down, it might take actions to prevent this, potentially making its prediction false. If it predicts it won't be shut down, it might behave in ways that lead to it being shut down, again invalidating its prediction. This isn't just a theoretical concern. It's a practical problem facing AI safety researchers today. Buridan's bridge also appears in computer security. Consider a security system that must predict whether a particular file is malicious before deciding whether to allow it to run. Clever attackers can design self-referential code that creates exactly the kind of paradox Buridan's bridge illustrates, potentially crashing security systems or forcing incorrect decisions. Some philosophers have argued that Buridan's bridge reveals fundamental limitations in rational thought itself. Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems demonstrated that any logical system complex enough to express basic arithmetic must contain statements that cannot be proven or disproven within that system. Buridan's bridge seems to show a similar limitation in our ability to handle self-reference in prediction. Others see the paradox as revealing something about the nature of truth and language. When we allow statements to refer to themselves or to conditions involving themselves, we create the potential for these strange loops where truth becomes undecidable. Perhaps this suggests that our conventional understanding of truth as a simple binary property, statements are either true or false, is fundamentally inadequate. Computer scientists have developed formal approaches to deal with these paradoxes. Three-valued logic adds a third truth value, undefined or paradoxical, beyond the traditional true and false. This allows systems to recognize and quarantine self-referential statements that would otherwise lead to contradiction. But this solution comes at a cost. It means accepting that some meaningful statements simply have no truth value. Another approach comes from modal logic, which distinguishes between different types of possibility and necessity. The Sphinx's statement mixes what logicians call alethic modality, what is actually true, with deontic modality, what should or must be done according to rules. Modal logic gives us tools to disambiguate these different types of necessity and possibility, potentially resolving the paradox. Philosophers like Alfred Tarski have proposed a hierarchy of languages, where statements about truth can only be made in a meta-language above the language containing the statements themselves. This prevents self-reference and the paradoxes it creates, but at the cost of an infinite hierarchy of increasingly powerful languages, an elegant theoretical solution that's impractical for real-world systems. These aren't just abstract concerns. As we build increasingly autonomous AI systems, we're essentially creating entities that must make predictions about the consequences of their own actions and the reactions of humans to those actions. If these predictions involve self-reference, our AI systems risk falling into exactly the kinds of logical traps that BURIDAN'S bridge illustrates. Some AI researchers argue that any sufficiently advanced AI will necessarily encounter these paradoxes and must be designed to handle them safely. Others worry that these logical traps might be fundamental barriers to certain types of artificial intelligence, that there might be inherent limitations to what prediction systems can accomplish when they can affect what they're predicting. The bridge paradox takes on new dimensions when we consider quantum mechanics and the role of observation in determining reality. In quantum systems, the act of observation affects the state being observed in ways that classical physics couldn't accommodate. This has led some philosophers to suggest that reality itself might contain irreducible elements of self-reference, potentially limiting what we can know and predict about the universe. From a practical perspective, BURIDAN'S bridge forces us to confront the limits of classical logic in guiding action. If there are meaningful questions that logic cannot answer, statements whose truth value is fundamentally undecidable, then how should rational agents behave when facing such situations? What does rationality even mean when logic itself breaks down? Some thinkers propose pragmatic approaches. When facing a logical impossibility, simply make a choice and move forward. This approach acknowledges the limits of pure reason and embraces the necessity of sometimes acting without complete logical justification. Perhaps when the Sphinx presents her paradoxical condition, the truly rational response is to simply walk away and find another bridge. Others suggest that BURIDAN'S bridge reveals something profound about free will and determinism. In a fully deterministic universe, all future states should be in principle predictable from current states. But if prediction itself can create paradoxes, perhaps there are fundamental limits to determinism, pockets of freedom created by the very impossibility of complete prediction. Regardless of the philosophical interpretation, BURIDAN'S bridge serves as a humbling reminder of the limits of human reasoning. For all our logical sophistication, there remain questions that simply cannot be answered within our existing frameworks, statements whose truth or falsehood cannot be determined, no matter how carefully we analyze them. As we build increasingly powerful prediction systems and artificial intelligences, these ancient paradoxes take on new urgency. They're no longer merely intellectual curiosities, but practical challenges we must address. The Sphinx at the bridge isn't just a figure from mythology. She represents the fundamental limits of prediction in a universe where the predictor is part of what's being predicted. Perhaps the deepest lesson of BURIDAN'S bridge is not about the particular paradox it presents, but about the inherent limitations of any system that attempts to completely understand itself. Just as Gödel proved that mathematics cannot prove its own consistency, BURIDAN'S bridge suggests that prediction systems cannot fully predict themselves. There may be an inescapable blind spot in any system's understanding of itself, a limitation not just of current knowledge, but of what can in principle be known. The next time you find yourself trying to predict how others will react to your predictions, or how your actions will change the very future you're trying to anticipate, remember the Sphinx at BURIDAN'S bridge. Some questions have no answer, some predictions make themselves impossible, and sometimes the most profound wisdom lies in recognizing the limits of what reason alone can tell us. The mere addition paradox. Which world is better? One with 10 billion people living lives barely worth living, or 1 billion people living in bliss? Through a series of seemingly reasonable steps, Philosophers have shown that logic leads us to conclude the overcrowded, barely happy world is better. This disturbing result challenges everything we believe about ethics and how we should value human life. Imagine a world called A, with 1 billion people all living extremely happy, fulfilling lives. Most would agree this is a good world. Now imagine we add another 1 billion people to create world A+. These additional people have lives that are less happy than the original population, but still worth living. They don't negatively affect the original population's happiness. Surely adding more happy lives makes the world better, or at least not worse, right? Now consider another world B, where everyone, all 2 billion people, has the same moderate level of happiness, higher than the added population in A+, but lower than the original population. The total happiness in B might be greater than in A+, since the loss of happiness for the original billion is outweighed by the gain for the second billion. Many would agree B is better than A+. Let's continue this process. We can create world C with 4 billion people at a lower level of happiness, but with more total happiness than B. Then world D with 8 billion people at an even lower level of happiness, but again with more total happiness. And so on, until we reach world Z, a vastly overcrowded planet with trillions of people whose lives are just barely worth living, containing only the smallest positive experiences and almost nothing we would recognize as human flourishing. This sequence of comparisons leads us to the repugnant conclusion: World Z, with its vast population living lives barely worth living, is better than World A, with its smaller population living in bliss. This deeply counterintuitive result emerges from 3 seemingly reasonable principles. 1. Adding happy lives to a population is never bad. 2. Equally distributing happiness across a population doesn't make things worse. And 3. A larger total amount of happiness is better than a smaller amount. This paradox was first identified by philosopher Derek Parfit in 1984, and it has troubled ethicists ever since. The steps in the argument seem individually reasonable, yet they lead to a conclusion most find morally repugnant. Who would choose a world where trillions live in near misery over one where billions live in joy? The paradox cuts to the heart of population ethics, the branch of philosophy concerned with moral questions about creating new people. It exposes tensions between different ways of valuing populations. Should we maximize total happiness, total utilitarianism, average happiness, average utilitarianism, or something else entirely? Total utilitarianism leads directly to the repugnant conclusion: if what matters is the sum of happiness across all people, then World Z is indeed better than World A because the vast number of people compensates for their barely worth living lives. But this seems to reduce humans to mere happiness containers, where quantity can always trump quality of life. Average utilitarianism avoids this particular trap, but creates others. If we should maximize average happiness, then a world with a single ecstatically happy person would be better than a world with billions of extremely happy people, plus one slightly less happy person, since the latter would lower the average. This too seems wrong. Some philosophers have tried to escape the paradox by rejecting one of the seemingly reasonable steps. Perhaps adding happy lives isn't always good. Perhaps equality of distribution isn't always preferable. Perhaps total happiness isn't what matters most. But each of these moves comes with its own counterintuitive implications. One approach is to adopt a critical level view, where adding a new life only improves the world if that life reaches a certain threshold of happiness, well above the barely worth living level. This avoids the repugnant conclusion, but introduces new problems. It implies that adding lives below but still above the zero level actually makes the world worse, which seems harsh toward people with modest but positive well-being. Another approach suggests that certain valuable experiences, like artistic achievement, deep relationships, or intellectual discovery, cannot be outweighed by any amount of minor pleasures. On this view, World A contains qualitatively different goods than World Z, making straightforward comparison impossible. But this requires abandoning the intuitive idea that happiness can be measured on a single scale. Some philosophers bite the bullet and accept the repugnant conclusion. arguing that our intuitive rejection of World Z stems from failures of imagination. Perhaps we underestimate how many lives barely worth living would equal one excellent life. Or perhaps we're biased toward quality over quantity in ways that don't stand up to ethical scrutiny. What makes the mere addition paradox particularly troubling is its real-world implications. We face actual choices about population size and quality of life. Should we aim for smaller populations with higher standards of living, or larger populations with more modest lives? Should we bring children into existence even if their lives will contain significant suffering along with joy? Current policies on environmental protection, reproductive rights, and resource distribution all implicitly take positions on these questions. Climate change makes the paradox especially relevant. Some argue that preventing climate catastrophe requires limiting population growth. Others suggest technological solutions could support larger populations sustainably. The mere addition paradox forces us to consider what kind of future world we should aim for, one with fewer people living better lives, or more people living more modest lives. The paradox also connects to questions about extinction risk. If we accept that adding happy lives is good, then preventing human extinction becomes morally urgent, as extinction would prevent countless potential future people from existing. But if those future lives would be barely worth living due to resource constraints or environmental degradation, the repugnant conclusion suggests this might still be better than a smaller, happier population. This creates difficult questions about how much current generations should sacrifice for potential future people. Transhumanist technologies raise further complications. If we could dramatically enhance human happiness through genetic engineering or brain-computer interfaces, should we prefer a smaller population of enhanced humans or a larger population of unenhanced ones? The mere addition paradox suggests that simply adding more moderately happy people might be better than creating fewer extraordinarily happy ones. Some philosophers see the paradox as revealing a fundamental limitation in consequentialist ethical frameworks that focus exclusively on outcomes. Perhaps what matters isn't just the resulting state of the world, but how we get there and the rights and responsibilities we have along the way. This moves the discussion toward deontological ethics, focused on duties and rights rather than just consequences. Others suggest that the paradox reveals something about the structure of value itself. Perhaps value isn't simply additive. Doubling the population doesn't simply double the value, even if individual happiness levels remain constant. This leads to complex mathematical models of population ethics that try to capture our intuitions more accurately than simple addition. The mere addition paradox also connects to questions about personal identity and existence. Is it better for a person to exist with a life barely worth living than not to exist at all? This question becomes especially difficult when we consider that non-existence isn't bad for anyone. There's no one who experiences the deprivation of not being brought into existence. Perhaps the deepest lesson of the paradox is that our moral intuitions about population ethics are inconsistent. We want to value both the quality and quantity of lives, both total and average well-being, both the happiness of individuals and the overall state of society. But the mere addition paradox shows that these values can come into conflict in ways that force difficult trade-offs. So which would you choose? A world with 1 billion people living in bliss? Or a world with trillions living lives just barely worth living? Your answer reveals something profound about your values, about whether you prioritize the intensity of individual experiences or the total amount of positive experience in the world. It forces you to consider whether mere addition of happy lives is always good, and whether there's more to human flourishing than just the quantity of happiness. The mere addition paradox doesn't just challenge our thinking about hypothetical future populations. It forces us to reconsider our most basic assumptions about what makes a life valuable and what makes a world good. It reveals that even seemingly reasonable ethical principles can lead to conclusions that conflict with our deepest moral intuitions, leaving us with the difficult task of revising either our principles or our intuitions. Perhaps there is no perfect solution to this paradox, no way to fully reconcile our conflicting values about population ethics. If so, the repugnant conclusion stands as a humbling reminder of the limitations of human moral reasoning and the complex ethical challenges we face as we shape the future of our species and our planet. MORAVEC'S paradox. We built computers that can defeat chess grandmasters and solve complex equations, but still can't build one that moves like a toddler. Why is advanced reasoning easy to program but basic physical interaction nearly impossible? The answer challenges everything we assume about intelligence and suggests consciousness isn't what we think it is. In the 1980s, artificial intelligence researcher Hans Moravec made a startling observation. Machines can easily outperform humans at tasks we find intellectually challenging, like calculating square roots or playing chess, yet they struggle desperately with skills any 5-year-old masters effortlessly, recognizing faces, picking up objects, or navigating a cluttered room. This unexpected inversion of difficulty has profound implications for our understanding of intelligence, consciousness, and what it means to be human. It is comparatively easy to make computers exhibit adult-level performance on intelligence tests or playing checkers, Moravec wrote, and difficult or impossible to give them the skills of a 1-year-old when it comes to perception and mobility. This insight, now known as Moravec's paradox, reveals a fundamental misconception about human cognition that has troubled philosophers, neuroscientists, and AI researchers for decades. We intuitively assume that conscious, rational thought represents the pinnacle of intelligence, the hardest cognitive feat. After all, it took humans millions of years of evolution to develop mathematical reasoning, language, and abstract thought. Yet from a computational perspective, these advanced capabilities prove far simpler to replicate than the seemingly basic sensorimotor skills we share with other animals. The resolution to this paradox lies in evolutionary history. The neural processes handling perception, movement, and object manipulation evolved over hundreds of millions of years of ruthless natural selection. These systems operate primarily below conscious awareness, having been refined through endless iterations of trial and error long before humans appeared. When an outfielder intuitively runs to where a baseball will land, they're not solving differential equations. They're using ancient neural systems that predict physical trajectories without conscious calculation. Conscious reasoning, by contrast, is a recent evolutionary development, a thin veneer atop these ancient systems. The abilities we're most proud of, mathematics, chess strategy, logical reasoning, emerged only in the last few 100,000 years. These capacities haven't been subject to the same extensive evolutionary refinement as our sensorimotor skills. Paradoxically, what we consider higher cognition is actually simpler in computational terms than the basic functions we take for granted. This insight turns traditional AI approaches upside down. Early AI researchers assumed that once machines mastered intellectual tasks like chess, general intelligence would quickly follow. Instead, we've created systems that can beat world champions at Go, but can't reliably pick up a coffee cup, the exact opposite of the expected progression. Moravec's paradox also challenges our philosophical understanding of consciousness. We typically center consciousness around explicit, verbal thought, the inner monologue that feels like us. Yet the paradox suggests that much of what makes human intelligence special occurs in systems operating beneath conscious awareness. The processes that allow us to catch a ball, recognize a face, or maintain balance while walking are sophisticated computational feats happening without conscious intervention. This has led some philosophers to suggest that consciousness itself might be less central to intelligence than we assume. Perhaps consciousness is not the commander of cognition, but more like a press secretary, creating coherent narratives about decisions made elsewhere in the brain. The parts of cognition we're conscious of might be precisely those parts that aren't fully optimized, the evolutionary newcomers still requiring deliberate attention. The paradox also explains why embodied intelligence, rather than abstract reasoning, presents the greater challenge for artificial intelligence. A robot needs to interact with the physical world through sensors and actuators, navigating the same messy, unpredictable environment that shaped our evolution. Computer vision must process ambiguous, noisy data. Robotic hands must manipulate objects with appropriate force and precision. These challenges require systems that can handle uncertainty, and adapt to novel situations, far harder computational problems than following the rigid rules of chess. AI researchers have increasingly recognized this reality. Modern approaches now emphasize machine learning, where systems improve through experience rather than through explicit programming, more like how biological intelligence evolves. The most successful recent AI systems learn by processing massive data sets, gradually developing implicit models of the world rather than following explicit rules. Despite these advances, Moravec's paradox remains largely unresolved. Even our most sophisticated robots still move with a clumsy awkwardness compared to the fluid grace of biological organisms. The gap between human and machine performance in embodied intelligence remains vast, even as machines have surpassed human capabilities in narrow intellectual domains. This persistent challenge suggests something profound about the nature of intelligence. Perhaps intelligence isn't a single capacity, but a collection of specialized adaptations, each shaped by different evolutionary pressures. What we call general intelligence might be an illusion, not a unitary capability, but a symphony of specialized systems working in concert, most operating below conscious awareness. This perspective has radical implications for how we think about consciousness and identity. If most of what makes human intelligence special happens unconsciously, what does that mean for our sense of self? If the conscious mind is just a small part of our cognitive architecture, how should we understand human experience and agency? Some philosophers have suggested that our subjective experience, the feeling of being a unified conscious entity, might be more like a user interface than a direct perception of reality. Just as a computer desktop presents complex underlying processes in a simplified form we can interact with, consciousness might present the brain's complex operations in a format that allows for planning and social coordination. The paradox also raises intriguing questions about the future of artificial intelligence. If we ever create machines with human-level general intelligence, they might have a completely different subjective experience than humans do. Their consciousness, if they have something we would recognize as consciousness, might be organized around different principles than ours, lacking the evolutionary history that shapes human experience. For roboticists and AI developers, Moravec's paradox presents both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is clear. Creating machines with human-like sensory-motor capabilities requires solving extraordinarily difficult computational problems. The opportunity lies in reconsidering our approaches to artificial intelligence, looking to biology for inspiration rather than imposing human logical structures on machines. Some researchers have embraced biologically inspired approaches like neural networks, genetic algorithms, and reinforcement learning. These methods allow systems to develop capabilities through experience rather than explicit programming, more like how biological intelligence evolves. Others explore hybrid approaches, combining rule-based systems for explicit reasoning with learning-based systems for perception and control. Beyond its technical implications, Moravec's paradox offers a humbling philosophical lesson. The aspects of intelligence we're most proud of, our capacity for mathematics, logic, and abstract reasoning, may actually be simpler than the capabilities we share with other animals. Our conscious, rational mind, the part we identify most strongly with our humanity, might be less central to intelligence than we've assumed. This insight invites us to reconsider what we value about human cognition. Perhaps what makes human intelligence special isn't just our capacity for abstract thought, but the integration of ancient sensory-motor intelligence with newer symbolic reasoning capabilities. Our embodied experience, moving through the world, manipulating objects, interacting physically with our environment, might be more fundamental to human cognition than pure abstract reasoning. For artificial intelligence researchers, this suggests that the path to truly intelligent machines might not lie in ever more sophisticated algorithms for explicit reasoning, but in systems that integrate perception, action, and reasoning in ways inspired by biological intelligence. Creating machines with human-like intelligence might require giving them bodies that interact with the physical world, allowing them to develop the embodied understanding that grounds human cognition. The paradox of tolerance. Absolute tolerance guarantees its own destruction. A society dedicated to unlimited freedom of speech and action will eventually be dominated by the intolerant and destroyed. This isn't theoretical, it's at the heart of free speech debates worldwide. The disturbing conclusion? Preserving tolerance paradoxically requires being intolerant of intolerance, a contradiction that exposes the fatal flaw at the heart of liberal democracy itself. The argument, first formalized by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, is brutally simple. If a society is unlimitedly tolerant, then it must tolerate those who are themselves intolerant. Eventually, the intolerant will seize power and destroy the very tolerance that allowed them to thrive. Therefore, unlimited tolerance is self-defeating. It leads inevitably to the destruction of tolerance itself. The only way to preserve a tolerant society is to paradoxically limit tolerance by not tolerating the intolerant. This creates an uncomfortable contradiction. How can we claim to value tolerance while simultaneously being intolerant of certain views? Isn't that fundamentally hypocritical? Yet if we don't make this exception, we're effectively surrendering to forces that will eliminate all tolerance. It's a conceptual trap with no clean escape, a paradox that forces us to either compromise our principles or watch them be destroyed from within. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is that both totalitarian regimes and free societies can justify their actions through its lens. Dictatorships can claim they're protecting society from dangerous ideas while suppressing all dissent. Liberal democracies can silence voices they deem extremist while claiming to protect freedom. Both can invoke the paradox of tolerance to justify their actions, leading to the disturbing conclusion that perhaps the difference between freedom and tyranny is ultimately arbitrary. History offers chilling examples of tolerant societies destroyed from within. The Weimar Republic, with its progressive constitution and expansive civil liberties, tolerated the Nazi Party as it openly called for the Republic's destruction. By the time many recognized the threat, it was too late. Similar patterns have played out repeatedly across time and geography. Tolerance extended to the violently intolerant has frequently led to tolerance's elimination. But drawing the line between acceptable and unacceptable intolerance creates its own dangers. Who decides which views are too intolerant to tolerate? Those with power can easily label opposing viewpoints as dangerous intolerance requiring suppression. What begins as a principled stand against genuine threats to tolerance can quickly become a pretext for silencing legitimate dissent. The cure may prove as deadly as the disease. The paradox becomes even more complex in the digital age. Social media platforms must decide what speech to allow and what to ban. Too much restriction smothers freedom of expression. Too little allows the spread of radicalizing content that can inspire real-world violence. Tech companies now effectively serve as global speech regulators, making daily judgments about the boundaries of acceptable discourse, judgments that directly engage the paradox of tolerance. Campus speech debates perfectly illustrate the paradox in action. Should universities allow speakers whose views many students consider hateful? If they do, they risk creating hostile environments for marginalized students. If they don't, they abandon their commitment to free inquiry and open debate. Both sides claim to be defending fundamental values, and both can legitimately cite the paradox of tolerance to support their position. What's particularly mind-boggling is that this paradox reveals a fundamental inconsistency in how we think about freedom. We want to believe that maximizing liberty leads to optimal outcomes for society. But the paradox of tolerance suggests that unlimited freedom contains the seeds of its own destruction, that too much liberty paradoxically leads to tyranny. This challenges the foundation of liberal democratic thought. Some argue the paradox is overblown, that the marketplace of ideas will naturally marginalize extreme views without requiring formal restrictions. In this view, bad ideas are best defeated through debate rather than suppression. But this optimistic take assumes rational discourse consistently prevails over emotional appeals and tribalism, an assumption increasingly questioned in our era of filter bubbles and algorithmic radicalization. Others argue that the paradox fundamentally misunderstands what tolerance means. True tolerance, they suggest, never meant accepting all behaviors and ideas. It meant allowing diverse perspectives while maintaining baseline standards necessary for society to function. In this view, restricting genuinely harmful intolerance isn't a paradoxical exception to tolerance, but part of its proper definition. The most disturbing implication of the paradox may be what it reveals about human nature and social dynamics. Perhaps truly tolerant societies are inherently unstable, unable to defend themselves against the eternal human tendencies toward tribalism, power-seeking, and ideological fervor. Perhaps tolerance is always a temporary condition, inevitably giving way to domination by the most intolerant factions unless actively defended through selective intolerance. What makes this paradox so controversial today is that both political extremes claim to be the true defenders of tolerance against intolerant opposition. The right claims to defend free speech against cancel culture, while the left claims to protect vulnerable groups against hateful rhetoric. Both accuse the other of exploiting tolerance to advance intolerant agendas. The paradox doesn't just describe abstract philosophical tension. It's actively weaponized in contemporary political warfare. This leads to a truly mind-bending possibility. Perhaps tolerance itself isn't the unalloyed good we've assumed. Maybe societies require a certain amount of intolerance to maintain their coherence and shared values. Every functional society throughout history has placed limits on acceptable behavior and expression. Complete tolerance may be not just impossible, but undesirable, a realization that challenges our most cherished liberal assumptions. The paradox connects to deeper questions about the limits of rationality in organizing human societies. Enlightenment thinkers believed rational principles like tolerance could create stable, just social orders. But the paradox of tolerance suggests that even our most carefully reasoned principles contain internal contradictions that can unravel when applied absolutely. Human societies may be too complex and paradoxical to be governed by pure, consistent principles. This tension manifests practically in how democracies handle anti-democratic movements. Should parties explicitly seeking to end democracy be allowed to participate in democratic elections? Germany's militant democracy approach bans parties deemed hostile to the constitutional order, a direct application of the idea that democracy must defend itself against those who would use democratic means to destroy it. But such restrictions open the door to suppressing legitimate opposition under the guise of defending democracy. What's most unsettling about the paradox of tolerance is that it admits no clean resolution. Any absolutist position, whether complete tolerance or zero tolerance for intolerance, leads to contradictions and potential catastrophes. We're left with only imperfect, contestable boundaries that must constantly be renegotiated as societies evolve. There is no algorithm, no perfect principle that resolves the paradox once and for all. This unresolvable tension reveals something profound about the human condition. Perhaps the most sophisticated response isn't to solve the paradox, but to recognize that living with contradiction is an inescapable part of social existence. The most stable societies may be those that acknowledge the paradox and develop resilient institutions and practices to navigate it, rather than pretending it can be eliminated through perfect philosophical principles. Some argue that focusing on the theoretical paradox misses the more practical question: what specific forms of intolerance actually threaten to destroy tolerant societies? Not all intolerant views possess equal danger. The paradox may be less about abstract principles and more about making context-specific judgments about genuine threats to the foundations of tolerance. But this pragmatic approach still requires drawing lines, still forces us to compromise pure tolerance. The darkest interpretation of the paradox is that it reveals tolerance to be an inherently unstable state, that human societies naturally gravitate toward intolerance unless actively pushed in the opposite direction. If true, this suggests that maintaining tolerant societies requires constant vigilance and intervention, not just passive commitment to tolerant principles. Tolerance may be less a stable state than a precarious balance requiring active maintenance. The ship of Theseus. An ancient ship has every plank gradually replaced until nothing original remains. Is it still the same ship? Now imagine someone collected all the discarded original pieces and rebuilt them elsewhere. Which is the real ship? This isn't just a word puzzle. It challenges our fundamental understanding of identity and has implications for everything from legal ownership to personal consciousness. The paradox originated in ancient Greece. Plutarch describes how the Athenians preserved the ship of their legendary hero Theseus for centuries in the harbor. As old planks rotted, they were replaced with new ones. Eventually, every single piece of the original vessel had been switched out. The philosophical question that emerged: is this still the ship of Theseus? Most people intuitively answer yes. After all, there was never a moment when the ship ceased to be Theseus's ship. The replacements happened gradually, maintaining the ship's continuity and function throughout. But this intuitive answer collapses when we add a twist first proposed by Thomas Hobbes. What if someone collected all the discarded original planks and reassembled them into a second ship? Now, which vessel is the authentic ship of Theseus, the renovated ship that maintained continuity of form but contains no original materials, or the reconstructed ship made of all original materials but lacking continuity? This is where the paradox explodes from a simple thought experiment into a fundamental challenge to how we understand identity itself. Either answer leads to disturbing implications that ripple across philosophy, law, religion, and our personal sense of self. If we say the renovated ship is the real one, we're claiming that material composition doesn't determine identity, that an object can have all its physical parts replaced while remaining the same thing. This implies that identity resides in form, function, or continuity rather than physical substance. But this creates a troubling question. If not its physical components, what exactly makes something what it is? If instead we say the reconstructed ship is the authentic one, we're arguing that material composition determines identity even when disassembled and reassembled. This suggests that a collection of original parts maintains its identity even through complete disintegration and reconstruction. But this creates equally difficult questions. At what point during disassembly did the original ship cease to exist? And how could mere reassembly resurrect its identity after it ceased to be a ship? What makes this paradox truly mind-bending is that there's no hidden trick or logical fallacy. It exposes a genuine limitation in our concept of identity. Our intuitions about what makes something the same thing over time simply don't yield consistent answers when pushed to extremes. Identity might not be an objective feature of reality, but rather a conceptual tool we impose on a world of constant flux. The implications extend far beyond ancient ships. Consider your smartphone. After multiple screen replacements, battery changes, and software updates, is it still the same phone you purchased years ago? If all original components were gathered and reassembled, which would be your real phone, especially if both contained your data? The paradox challenges our assumptions about ownership and authenticity in an age of constant technological renewal and repair. The legal system faces this paradox constantly. If a corporation replaces all its employees, leadership, and even its business model while maintaining legal continuity, is it truly the same company for purposes of contracts and liability? Courts have generally privileged continuity over material composition, allowing corporations to maintain their legal identity despite complete turnover. But this represents a philosophical choice, not an objective truth. Religious traditions confront the paradox when considering resurrection and afterlife. If a person's body is completely reconstituted after death, is it the same person who lived before? Some traditions emphasize material continuity, insisting on the resurrection of the actual physical body. Others focus on continuity of soul or consciousness, viewing the body as a replaceable vessel. The ship of Theseus paradox lurks within these theological debates. The most unsettling application concerns personal identity. Your body replaces most of its cells over time. Your memories are constantly being reconsolidated, subtly changing with each retrieval. Your values, beliefs, and personality evolve throughout life. If virtually nothing about you, physically or psychologically, remains constant from childhood to old age, what justifies the claim that you remain the same person throughout your life? Modern science intensifies this question. If we could teleport you by scanning your exact atomic structure, disintegrating your body, and reconstructing it perfectly elsewhere, would the reconstructed person be you? What if the original wasn't destroyed? Would there then be two yous? The paradox forces us to confront the possibility that personal identity might be more conceptual than metaphysical, a useful fiction rather than an objective fact. Some philosophers suggest we should abandon the search for necessary and sufficient conditions for identity over time. Perhaps identity isn't a binary yes, no property, but exists on a spectrum. The renovated ship of Theseus might be 70% the same ship as the original through spatial-temporal continuity, while the reconstructed ship might be 60% the same through material continuity. This approach avoids contradiction, but fundamentally changes how we understand identity. Others propose that the paradox reveals something profound about human cognition. Our concept of identity evolved to track macroscopic objects in everyday contexts where gradual change and reassembly rarely conflict. The ship of Theseus creates an artificial scenario where two powerful identity intuitions, continuity and material composition, clash in ways our conceptual system wasn't designed to handle. The paradox may reveal more about the limitations of human cognition than about metaphysical reality. Eastern philosophical traditions often embrace the paradox rather than trying to resolve it. Buddhism's concept of impermanence, anicca, directly challenges the notion of fixed identity. The Buddha taught that all phenomena are in constant flux, with no permanent essence. From this perspective, the ship of Theseus paradox isn't a puzzle to solve, but a demonstration of a fundamental truth, that our perception of stable, enduring entities is an illusion concealing the reality of constant change. Contemporary metaphysicians have proposed various technical solutions. Some adopt four-dimensionalism, viewing objects as extended through time as well as space. The ship of Theseus isn't a three-dimensional object that somehow maintains identity while changing, but a four-dimensional object made up of different temporal parts. Others embrace mereological essentialism, arguing that an object cannot survive the replacement of any of its parts, meaning the ship of Theseus ceased to be the original ship with the very first replacement. But these technical solutions often seem to miss what makes the paradox so compelling. The ship of Theseus resonates because it challenges our everyday understanding of what makes something, or someone, the same over time. It forces us to confront the possibility that the apparent stability of objects and identities around us, and within us, might be a useful fiction rather than a metaphysical reality. The paradox becomes particularly relevant in the digital age. When your consciousness is shaped by social media algorithms, your memories are stored in the cloud, and your identity is fragmented across different platforms and personas. What constitutes the real you? If technology eventually allows mind uploading, would your digital copy be you, or merely a simulation that thinks it's you? The ancient paradox anticipated questions at the cutting edge of contemporary technology ethics. What makes the ship of Theseus paradox so disturbing is that it suggests identity might not be an objective feature of reality, but rather a conceptual tool that breaks down in extreme cases. If even the identity of a physical object like a ship becomes unclear under scrutiny, how much more tenuous must be the identities we ascribe to more complex entities like corporations, nations, and persons? Perhaps identity itself is less a discovery about the world and more a construction we impose upon it. The paradox ultimately reveals a profound tension in human thought. We crave the stability and continuity that identity provides. We want to believe that things and people remain the same despite change. Yet we're confronted with a reality of constant flux and transformation that undermines this stability. The ship of Theseus forces us to navigate this tension, challenging us to reconsider what it means for anything, an object, an institution, or a person, to persist as the same through the relentless river of change that constitutes existence. The simulation argument. Mathematics says you're almost certainly living in a simulation right now. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's the conclusion of Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom's mathematical analysis. If advanced civilizations can create simulated realities, then simulated minds would vastly outnumber real ones, meaning the odds are overwhelming that you're one of the simulations. The argument is deceptively simple, but leads to an earth-shattering conclusion. Bostrom begins with a trilemma. One of these three statements must be true. 1. Advanced civilizations go extinct before developing simulation technology. 2. Advanced civilizations have no interest in running ancestral simulations. Or 3. We are almost certainly living in a computer simulation right now. Let's unpack why this logic is so disturbingly sound. Imagine a future where technology has mastered consciousness itself. Our descendants could create virtual environments populated with fully conscious simulated beings who believe themselves to be real. These simulations would be indistinguishable from reality for those inside them, complete with convincing physics, sensory experiences, and subjective consciousness. Now consider the numbers. If even one civilization reaches this technological level and decides to run simulations of its evolutionary history, they could create billions or trillions of simulated minds. The simulated beings would vastly outnumber the biological ones. Simple probability then suggests we're almost certainly among the simulated majority rather than the biological minority. What makes this paradox so unsettling is that it doesn't rely on fringe science or mysticism. It's a straightforward application of probability. If simulation technology is possible, then unless civilizations consistently choose not to use it, the statistical conclusion becomes inescapable. Reality is not what we think it is. Your entire life, with all its emotional richness and seeming authenticity, is likely just lines of code in someone else's computer. The philosophical implications are staggering. If we're in a simulation, what does that mean for concepts like free will? Are our choices determined by the program, making our sense of agency an illusion? What about consciousness itself? Is simulated consciousness fundamentally different from real consciousness? Or are they equivalent? The simulation hypothesis forces us to confront the possibility that the distinction between real and virtual might be meaningless from the inside. Even more disturbing is what this implies about the nature of our universe. The laws of physics might not be fundamental truths, but merely parameters set by the programmers, optimized perhaps for computational efficiency rather than some deeper meaning. The simulation might even take shortcuts, rendering only what's being observed at any moment, like a video game that only generates the parts of the world the player is looking at. Physicist James Gates made a startling discovery that adds credence to the simulation hypothesis. He found error-correcting codes embedded in the equations of supersymmetry, the same type of codes used in web browsers and computer systems. While not conclusive evidence, it's exactly the kind of signature we might expect to find if our reality were indeed a mathematical construct. If we are in a simulation, what might the purpose be? Perhaps we're an ancestral simulation run by our own descendants, studying their evolutionary history. Maybe we're a scientific experiment testing social or psychological theories. More unsettlingly, we could be entertainment, the equivalent of an incredibly sophisticated video game, with the player perhaps controlling one specific human while the rest of us are just highly developed NPCs. The simulation argument creates a disturbing regression. If we're in a simulation, what about the reality in which our simulators exist? They too could be simulations within a higher level reality. This creates a potentially infinite hierarchy of realities, raising the question, is there an original base reality at all, or is it simulations all the way down? Some scientists, including Elon Musk, find the argument compelling enough to state that the odds we're in base reality are 1 in billions. Others like Neil deGrasse Tyson put the probability above 50%. These aren't fringe figures but mainstream thinkers grappling with the cold logic of Bostrom's analysis. What would it mean to find evidence that we're in a simulation? Physicists suggest we might look for computational artifacts, glitches in the matrix, so to speak. These could include fundamental limits to physical resolution, like the Planck length, unexpected patterns in cosmic background radiation, or even computational shortcuts in physics when nobody's looking. Some have proposed that quantum mechanical oddities, like particles that don't have definite properties until measured, might actually be computational efficiencies in the simulation. Perhaps the most mind-bending implication is the possibility that the simulation could be switched off. Everything you've ever known, everyone you've ever loved, all of human history and future potential could be erased in an instant if our simulators decide to end the program or simply face a power outage. Your entire existence hangs by the most tenuous of threads, the continued interest and computational resources of beings you can never communicate with or understand. But what if we could communicate with our simulators? Computer scientist and philosopher Roman Yampolsky suggests that sufficiently advanced civilizations within a simulation might be able to detect their simulated nature and potentially even hack the simulation. This raises the disturbing possibility that certain religious experiences throughout history, moments when people claim to communicate with entities outside our reality, might actually represent glitches or intentional contact from our simulators. The simulation hypothesis creates a modern version of Pascal's wager. If we might be in a simulation run by beings monitoring our behavior, is it rational to act as if we're being watched and judged? This logic parallels religious arguments about divine judgment, but with advanced technology replacing supernatural deities. Some suggest that if we are in a simulation, we should try to be interesting to reduce the risk of the simulation being terminated out of boredom. Even if the probability we're in a simulation is small, the implications are so profound that many take the hypothesis seriously. Philosopher David Chalmers argues that learning we're in a simulation wouldn't invalidate our lives or experiences. Simulated pain and love would be no less real to us than physical pain and love. Our subjective experiences remain meaningful, even if the underlying substrate is different than we assumed. Critics of the simulation argument point out that creating conscious simulations might be impossible or require computational resources that make large-scale ancestral simulations impractical. Others suggest that advanced civilizations might have ethical prohibitions against creating conscious beings in simulations, especially if those simulations contain suffering. But these objections only strengthen the first two horns of Bostrom's trilemma. They don't eliminate the logical structure of the argument itself. The simulation hypothesis shares similarities with ancient philosophical traditions. Plato's allegory of the cave described humans perceiving only shadows of reality rather than reality itself. Eastern philosophies like Buddhism and Hinduism have long suggested that conventional reality is an illusion, Maya, concealing a deeper truth. The simulation argument offers a technological framework for ideas that have haunted human thought for millennia. What makes the simulation hypothesis particularly disturbing is its unfalsifiability. Any evidence against the simulation could simply be part of the simulation's design. If we're in a perfectly crafted simulation, there would be no way to conclusively prove or disprove our simulated status from within the system. This places the hypothesis in a philosophical limbo, logically compelling yet potentially impossible to verify. Whether we're in a simulation or not, the argument reveals something profound about consciousness and reality. It suggests that subjective experience can exist independent of its underlying substrate, that consciousness doesn't require biology, but could emerge from any sufficiently complex information processing system. Perhaps the distinction between real and simulated consciousness is meaningless, with subjective experience being the only reality that ultimately matters. The simulation argument forces us to confront the fragility of everything we take for granted. The solid world around you, the consistency of physical laws, the continuity of your own existence, all might be contingent on the whims of programmers in a higher reality. Yet, paradoxically, this unsettling possibility doesn't necessarily diminish the meaning or value of our experiences. Simulated joy, love, and wonder would feel just as real and significant to us as their non-simulated counterparts. The omniscience paradox. Perfect knowledge might be logically impossible, even for God. A being who knows everything must know what it feels like to be uncertain. Yet truly knowing uncertainty requires actually experiencing it, which would mean not knowing something with certainty. This contradiction suggests perfect knowledge might be logically impossible, challenging traditional conceptions of divine omniscience that have shaped religious thought for centuries. The paradox strikes at the heart of how we conceptualize God in the Abrahamic traditions. If God is defined as all-knowing, then God must know every possible experience and mental state, including those involving limited knowledge, doubt, and confusion. But to truly know what uncertainty feels like requires actually being uncertain about something, which contradicts omniscience. An omniscient being cannot simultaneously know everything with certainty and experience the authentic mental state of uncertainty. This isn't just wordplay. It reveals a genuine logical contradiction within the concept of complete knowledge. It suggests omniscience might be self-contradictory, like a square circle or a married bachelor. The implications are profound. If omniscience contains an inherent contradiction, then no being, not even God, could possess complete knowledge. Theologians have proposed various solutions. Some argue that God knows uncertainty conceptually without experiencing it. God understands what uncertainty is without being uncertain. But this creates a new problem. If God only knows uncertainty conceptually but not experientially, then God's knowledge is incomplete. God would know the concept of uncertainty, but not the experience, which still contradicts true omniscience. Others suggest that God can simulate uncertainty without actually being uncertain, like an actor portraying confusion while remaining aware they're acting. But this still leaves God with mere simulation, rather than authentic experience, again rendering divine knowledge incomplete. Some theological traditions address this by distinguishing between different types of knowledge. Perhaps God possesses complete propositional knowledge, knowing all facts, while lacking certain experiential knowledge. But this requires redefining omniscience in ways that deviate from traditional understandings of God's complete knowledge. The paradox extends beyond uncertainty to other mental states that seem incompatible with omniscience. Can an omniscient being know what it's like to make a genuine discovery? To be surprised? To learn something new? Each of these experiences seems to require a prior state of not knowing, directly contradicting omniscience. Consider another version of the paradox. Can God know what it's like to commit a sin while believing it's right? Such knowledge would require God to have false beliefs that sin is good, which contradicts omniscience. Yet without this knowledge, God's understanding would be incomplete. This paradox reveals something profound about the nature of knowledge itself. Perhaps complete knowledge isn't simply accumulating more and more facts, but involves fundamentally different types of knowing that can't all be possessed simultaneously. Some forms of knowledge might mutually exclude others, making truly complete knowledge logically impossible. The paradox challenges us to reconsider what we mean by knowing everything. Is omniscience about knowing all facts, understanding all perspectives, or something else entirely? Perhaps traditional conceptions of divine knowledge have been too simplistic, failing to account for the complex, multifaceted nature of knowledge itself. Some philosophers argue the paradox ultimately reveals limitations in human language and concepts, rather than limitations in divine capability. Perhaps omniscience transcends our cognitive frameworks in ways we can't articulate or fully comprehend. The apparent contradiction might reflect the inadequacy of human concepts, rather than a genuine logical impossibility. The paradox connects to broader questions in epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge. What does it mean to truly know something? Is conceptual understanding without direct experience sufficient for knowledge? If not, then complete knowledge might require contradictory states, making it inherently impossible. Modern discussions of artificial intelligence raise similar questions. Could an AI system ever claim to know everything? The paradox suggests that even if an AI accumulated all factual information in the universe, it would still lack knowledge of certain experiential states that require limited knowledge. The omniscience paradox forces us to confront the possibility that complete knowledge might be an incoherent concept, not just practically unattainable, but logically impossible. This challenges foundations of theological thought and our understanding of knowledge itself. Perhaps the most profound insight from this paradox is that knowledge has inherent structural limitations, boundaries not even a god could transcend. The paradox ultimately reveals that certain ideals we've long assumed to be coherent, like perfect knowledge, might contain hidden contradictions when examined closely. This doesn't necessarily disprove God's existence, but it might require reconceptualizing divine attributes in more sophisticated ways than traditional theology has offered. The unexpected examination paradox. A professor announces a surprise exam next week. A student proves logically that such an exam is impossible, yet, when it happens on Wednesday, they're still surprised. This isn't a trick, it's a demonstration that perfect logical reasoning can lead to conclusions that contradict reality, challenging our faith in deductive reasoning itself. Here's the scenario. A professor tells her class, "There will be a surprise exam one day next week. You won't know which day it's coming until you see me walk in with the test papers." A clever student raises his hand with an objection. "That's impossible," he says, and proceeds with this reasoning. "The exam can't be on Friday. If we reach Thursday without having had the exam, we would know with certainty it must be on Friday, making it expected, not a surprise. But if Friday is eliminated, then the exam can't be on Thursday either. If we reach Wednesday without an exam, and we know it can't be on Friday, then Thursday would be the only remaining option, again making it expected, not a surprise. By the same logic, we can eliminate Wednesday, Tuesday, and finally Monday. Therefore, a surprise exam is logically impossible." The professor smiles and says nothing. When she arrives on Wednesday with exam papers, the student is genuinely surprised, despite having proven this couldn't happen. This is the unexpected examination paradox, and it reveals a disturbing disconnect between logical perfection and real-world reasoning. What makes this paradox so unsettling is that the student's logical deduction seems flawless. Each step follows validly from the previous one, yet reality contradicts the conclusion. Either logic itself is unreliable, or something in our application of logic to this situation has gone terribly wrong. The paradox was first published in 1943 and has troubled philosophers ever since. It's not just a clever trick, but a fundamental challenge to epistemology, the study of knowledge and justified belief. It suggests that perfect logical reasoning can lead us astray, raising disturbing questions about what we can truly know with certainty. One proposed solution focuses on self-reference. The professor's announcement becomes part of the student's knowledge base, which then figures into whether the exam is surprising. This creates a circular reasoning pattern. The surprise depends on their beliefs, which depend on the announcement, which depends on the surprise. This self-reference might make the professor's statement impossible to classify as simply true or false. Another approach suggests the problem lies in conflating different types of knowledge. There's a difference between knowing that an exam will occur and knowing that you know it will occur. The student's mistake might be assuming that if the exam occurs on a specific day, students will necessarily know in advance that it will occur then. Some philosophers argue the paradox reveals limitations in our concept of knowledge itself. Perhaps knowledge isn't as straightforward as we assume. The paradox suggests that announcements about future knowledge can create situations where logical deduction and reality diverge in ways we struggle to reconcile. The paradox connects to broader questions about logical omniscience. The idea that if you know certain premises, you automatically know all their logical consequences. The student's argument assumes that if it's Friday without an exam, students would automatically deduce the exam must be that day. But real humans don't instantly draw all logical conclusions from what they know. We have cognitive limitations. Modern interpretations connect the paradox to game theory and strategic reasoning. The professor and students are in a complex game of expectations and knowledge. The professor's announcement creates a self-defeating prophecy. If students believe it and reason logically, they'll conclude no exam is possible, letting their guard down and ensuring they'll be surprised whenever it comes. The paradox shares similarities with other self-referential puzzles like the liar paradox. This statement is false. These paradoxes suggest that natural language and logic sometimes create statements that cannot be consistently evaluated, neither clearly true nor clearly false, but somehow stuck in logical limbo. Financial markets face similar paradoxes. If all investors could perfectly predict a market crash, they would sell beforehand, causing the crash to happen earlier, invalidating the original prediction. Perfect prediction becomes logically impossible in systems where predictions change the outcome, creating unexpected examination-like paradoxes in real-world contexts. What makes this paradox particularly disturbing is its challenge to deductive reasoning itself. If perfect deductive logic can lead to conclusions contradicted by reality, what can we truly know with certainty? The paradox suggests that even our most careful reasoning might contain hidden flaws or inappropriate assumptions that undermine its reliability. Some resolution approaches focus on the definition of surprise. Perhaps the professor simply meant the exam wouldn't be announced the day before. Not that students couldn't deduce its date through elimination. But this seems to miss the paradox's deeper implications about knowledge, reasoning, and announcement effects on beliefs. The paradox ultimately reveals a disconnect between idealized logical reasoning and actual human cognition. Perfect logical agents who instantly drew all conclusions from their knowledge might indeed find surprise exams impossible. But real humans, with our cognitive limitations and imperfect reasoning, can be genuinely surprised despite having all the information needed to expect the event. This insight has profound implications for artificial intelligence. As we create increasingly sophisticated reasoning systems, they may encounter similar paradoxes, situations where perfect logical deduction leads to conclusions contradicted by reality. Understanding these limitations is crucial for developing AI that can navigate the messy, paradoxical nature of real-world reasoning. The unexpected examination paradox stands as a humbling reminder of reasoning's limitations. It suggests that even in apparently straightforward scenarios, perfect logical deduction can lead us astray. The next time you're absolutely certain about something based on a seemingly airtight logical argument, remember the student confidently proving that a surprise exam was impossible, right before being surprised by exactly what he had proven couldn't happen. The Grim Reaper paradox. Infinitely many executioners each plan to kill you at specific times approaching noon, if you're still alive at their appointed time. It seems you must die before noon, yet for any specific moment, it can be proven that you won't die then. This mathematical nightmare forces us to reconsider our understanding of infinity and continuous time. Imagine an infinite army of Grim Reapers waiting to end your life. The first Reaper will strike at 11:30 a.m. if you're still alive. The second will strike at 11:45 a.m. if you're still alive. The third at 11:52:30, the fourth at 11:56:15, and so on. Each Reaper assigned a moment halfway between the previous Reaper's time and noon. Each Reaper follows two simple rules. If you're already dead when their time comes, they do nothing. If you're still alive at their exact assigned moment, they instantaneously kill you. Given these conditions, a disturbing question emerges. Will you survive until noon? The paradox arises when we try to determine your fate. On one hand, it seems impossible for you to survive until noon. With an infinite number of Reapers stationed at times approaching noon, surely one of them will kill you. On the other hand, it seems equally impossible for you to die at any specific time before noon. For any given moment, we can prove you won't die then. Why? Consider any specific time before noon. Say, 11:45 a.m. If you die at 11:45, it must be because the Reaper assigned to 11:45 killed you. But this Reaper only acts if you're still alive at exactly 11:45. For you to be alive at 11:45, you must have survived all the Reaper attacks scheduled before 11:45. But there are infinitely many Reapers assigned to times between 11:30 and 11:45. To survive all these attacks is impossible, meaning you must have died before 11:45, which contradicts our assumption that you die at 11:45. This reasoning applies to any time you might die. For every specific moment, we can prove you must have already died earlier, creating an impossible infinite regress. You can't die at any specific time, yet you can't survive them all. This logical impasse seems unsolvable. The paradox exposes profound tensions in our understanding of infinity and continuity. It involves what mathematicians call a supertask, an infinite sequence of operations performed in finite time. While mathematics can describe such processes abstractly, their physical possibility remains questionable. Some philosophers argue the paradox reveals that time cannot be infinitely divisible, that at some fundamental level, time must be discrete rather than continuous. If time consists of indivisible moments rather than a continuous flow, the infinite regress becomes impossible, dissolving the paradox. Quantum physics lends some support to this view, suggesting a fundamental unit of time, the Planck time, below which time intervals may not be meaningful. Others suggest the paradox demonstrates the impossibility of completing actual infinities in the physical world. While mathematics comfortably handles potential infinities, processes that can continue without end, actual infinities, completed infinite collections, may be physically impossible. If so, the infinitely many reapers couldn't exist in reality, making the scenario physically impossible, even if logically describable. Some approach the paradox by questioning the coherence of the setup itself. Perhaps the scenario involves hidden contradictions that make it logically impossible, similar to asking what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. If the scenario itself is contradictory, we shouldn't expect a coherent answer about your fate. Modern mathematical approaches use transfinite ordinals, numbers that extend beyond the infinity of counting numbers. These might resolve the paradox by providing a framework for handling infinitely many steps in finite time. Your death might occur at an infinitesimal moment before noon, a time after all the Reaper assignments, but before noon itself, inhabiting a mathematical twilight zone in the hyper-real number system. The paradox connects to famous problems in the history of mathematics, like Zeno's paradoxes of motion and the Thomson lamp, which switches on-off infinitely many times. All these puzzles challenge our intuitions about infinity, continuity, and the possibility of infinite processes completing in finite time. What makes the Grim Reaper paradox particularly disturbing is that it creates a scenario where something must happen. You must die before noon, yet it cannot happen at any specific time. This seems to violate the fundamental principle that events must occur at specific times. Some philosophers suggest the paradox reveals limitations in classical logic when applied to infinite scenarios. Perhaps our binary logic, where propositions must be either true or false, breaks down when confronting actual infinities. Alternative logical systems, like many-valued or fuzzy logics, might provide better frameworks for handling such scenarios. The paradox also raises questions about determinism and causality. In a deterministic universe, your fate should be settled by initial conditions and physical laws. Yet the Grim Reaper scenario creates a situation where your fate seems logically undeterminable. Neither survival nor death at any specific time is possible. This suggests either our concepts of determinism or our understanding of infinity must be revised. The Grim Reaper paradox ultimately forces us to confront the profound tensions between our mathematical understanding of infinity and our physical intuitions about time and causality. It suggests that either our understanding of infinity requires revision, our concept of continuous time is flawed, or our logical frameworks break down when confronting certain infinite scenarios. Far from being merely a philosophical curiosity, the paradox touches on fundamental questions in physics and mathematics. Whether time is continuous or discrete, whether actual infinities can exist physically, and how causality operates in infinite systems are questions at the frontier of theoretical physics and the foundations of mathematics. The next time you think about dividing something infinitely many times, or imagine processes approaching a limit, remember the Grim Reapers waiting in the mathematical shadows, and consider that our most basic intuitions about infinity and continuity might conceal profound paradoxes that challenge our understanding of reality itself. The two-envelope paradox. You choose between two envelopes, knowing one contains twice as much money as the other. After picking, you're told you can switch. Mathematical analysis suggests switching gives you a 25% gain, regardless of which envelope you initially chose. This implies an endless switching loop that defies probability theory and reveals flaws in how we reason about expected values. Imagine two sealed envelopes before you. You're told one contains twice as much money as the other. Perhaps one has $10 and the other $20. Or one has $50 and the other $100. You don't know which is which. You pick an envelope. Before opening it, you're offered the chance to switch. Should you switch? Intuition suggests it doesn't matter. You have a 50% chance of having the larger amount already and a 50% chance of having the smaller amount. Switching wouldn't change these odds. But a simple mathematical argument suggests otherwise, and that's where the paradox emerges. Let's call the amount in your chosen envelope X. Given what you know, the other envelope contains either 2 X's or X divided by 2. Each possibility has a 50% probability. If you switch, your expected value is 0.5 times 2, X plus 0.5 times X divided by 2 equals X plus X divided by 4 equals 1.25X. This calculation suggests that switching gives you an expected value 25% greater than keeping your original envelope. But this creates an absurd situation. If switching always gives a 25% advantage, you could switch back and forth endlessly, each time increasing your expected value by 25%. This is clearly impossible. What makes this paradox so unsettling is that the mathematical reasoning appears sound, yet leads to an obviously wrong conclusion. The error isn't a simple calculation mistake, but reveals deeper issues in how we reason about uncertainty and expected value. One resolution focuses on the problematic assumption that you can treat the amount in your envelope as a fixed value X when calculating expected values. In reality, this amount is itself a random variable. When properly accounting for this, the apparent advantage of switching disappears. Consider a specific scenario. The envelopes contain either $5 and $10 or $10 and $20. If you pick randomly, you have equal chances of getting $5, $10 from either pair, or $20. A correct expected value calculation shows no advantage to switching once these specific possibilities are properly accounted for. The paradox exploits a subtle confusion between conditional and unconditional probabilities. When you observe the amount in your envelope, you gain information that changes the probabilities in ways the simple calculation overlooks. This highlights how easily our intuitive probability reasoning can lead us astray. What makes this paradox particularly valuable is that similar flawed reasoning appears in real-world financial decisions. Investors often make decisions based on expected value calculations that fail to properly account for the conditional nature of information. The two-envelope paradox serves as a warning against such errors. The paradox connects to deeper questions in decision theory. It challenges how we formulate decision problems and calculate expected values, fundamental concepts in economics, statistics, and artificial intelligence. If straightforward expected value calculations can lead to such absurdities, what does this imply for our decision-making frameworks? Some philosophers see the paradox as revealing limitations in Bayesian decision theory, the dominant framework for reasoning under uncertainty. Others argue it merely shows the importance of properly specifying the probability distributions involved. Either way, it exposes the fragility of mathematical reasoning when probability and infinity intersect. Information theorists have their own take. From an information theoretic perspective, the paradox arises from an ill-posed problem with insufficient constraints. Without a well-defined probability distribution for the amounts in the envelopes, the expected value calculation becomes mathematically meaningless. The paradox also reveals something profound about mathematical modeling. When we translate real-world problems into mathematical form, subtle choices in how we frame the problem can lead to dramatically different conclusions. The envelope paradox presents a case where an apparently reasonable formulation leads to an absurd result. Financial mathematicians point out similar paradoxes in stock market models. Certain trading strategies appear to offer guaranteed returns when analyzed using flawed mathematical reasoning similar to the envelope paradox. These arbitrage opportunities vanish when the models are properly formulated, a lesson many investors learn the hard way. The most disturbing implication may be what this reveals about human reasoning. Even trained mathematicians can find the flaw in the envelope argument elusive at first. Our cognitive processes seem prone to certain types of errors when reasoning about uncertainty. Errors that formal mathematical training doesn't automatically prevent. The two-envelope paradox serves as a humbling reminder of the fragility of probabilistic reasoning. It shows how easily we can make logical errors when dealing with uncertainty, even in apparently simple scenarios. For all our mathematical sophistication, probability remains counterintuitive in ways that continue to trip up even the most careful thinkers. Next time someone offers you a choice between two unknown options with the possibility of switching, remember the two-envelope paradox. The mathematics of your decision might be more complicated than they first appear, and the seemingly obvious calculation could lead you deeply astray. The raven paradox. Observing your coffee cup technically proves something about ravens. This isn't metaphor, it's mathematically proven. The scientific method itself contains a logical flaw so profound, it threatens to unravel everything we think we know about evidence, confirmation, and the foundations of human knowledge. The raven paradox doesn't just challenge science. It exposes the disturbing possibility that rational thought itself may be fundamentally broken. Here's the mind-shattering revelation. According to the laws of logic that underpin all scientific reasoning, observing a white shoe provides evidence that all ravens are black. Yes, you read that correctly. And no, this isn't a trick or wordplay. It's a legitimate consequence of logic that has haunted philosophers of science for a century. The paradox emerges from a simple logical equivalence. The statement, "all ravens are black," is logically equivalent to "all non-black things are non-ravens." These statements must have the same truth value. Either both are true or both are false. When you confirm one, you necessarily confirm the other. So how does observing a white shoe provide evidence about ravens? When you observe a white shoe, you're confirming an instance of the statement, "all non-black things are non-ravens." You found a non-black thing, the white shoe, and confirmed it's a non-raven. Since this statement is logically equivalent to "all ravens are black," you've technically provided evidence supporting the raven hypothesis. This shatters our intuitive understanding of evidence. We believe evidence about ravens should come from observing ravens, not shoes or coffee cups. Yet ironclad logic tells us otherwise. If you accept the foundations of logical reasoning, the very bedrock of scientific thought, you must accept this disturbing conclusion. What's truly unsettling is that this isn't a fringe idea or philosophical game. The paradox was identified by Carl Hempel in 1945 and remains unresolved despite decades of effort by the world's greatest minds. It reveals a fundamental tension in how we understand evidence and confirmation, a crack in the foundation of scientific reasoning that cannot be easily dismissed. The implications are staggering. Every scientific study, every medical trial, every piece of evidence you've ever evaluated may be fundamentally flawed at a logical level. The paradox suggests our entire framework for determining what counts as evidence, the cornerstone of rational thought, contains a deep inconsistency that philosophers of science have never satisfactorily resolved. Some attempt to escape by arguing that observations of non-ravens provide extremely weak evidence about ravens, technically valid but practically insignificant. But this solution fails under scrutiny. If you accept that such evidence is valid at all, you've already conceded the paradoxical point. And if you try to quantify just how much weaker such evidence is, you fall into new mathematical traps that expose further inconsistencies. Others suggest the paradox reveals problems with the logical form of scientific statements. Perhaps universal generalizations like "all ravens are black" should be replaced with probabilistic statements. But this merely shifts the problem. The same logical paradoxes emerge in probabilistic frameworks, only with more complex mathematical disguises. The most disturbing resolution suggests that evidence itself is not objective, but depends on our background knowledge. What counts as evidence becomes relative to what we already believe, creating a circular dependency that undermines the objectivity of science itself. Is evidence in the eye of the beholder? If so, the entire scientific enterprise sits on shakier ground than we care to admit. Consider the real-world implications. Courts of law rely on the concept of relevant evidence. Yet the Raven paradox suggests our intuitive notions of relevance contradict basic logic. Scientific studies discard irrelevant observations, potentially discarding valid evidence according to strict logic. Every field that distinguishes between relevant and irrelevant evidence may be making distinctions that logic itself cannot support. The paradox connects to artificial intelligence in particularly troubling ways. As we build systems to reason autonomously, they may either replicate our flawed human intuitions about evidence or follow strict logic into paradoxical conclusions. Either way, the systems determining your credit score, medical diagnosis, or criminal risk assessment may harbor these same logical contradictions, silently corrupting their judgments in ways their creators don't understand. What's most unsettling is what this reveals about human cognition. Our brains evolved practical reasoning systems that often diverge from strict logic, suggesting our intuitions about evidence may be useful heuristics rather than reflections of logical truth. We may be fundamentally incapable of reasoning with perfect logical consistency about evidence. Our minds may be built to take shortcuts that avoid paradoxes rather than resolve them. Some philosophers go further, suggesting the paradox reveals the bankruptcy of the hypothetico-deductive model of science itself. If confirming predictions can involve such counterintuitive examples, perhaps the entire framework of hypothesis testing requires radical revision. This threatens not just specific scientific theories, but the meta-theory of how science itself operates. The paradox forces us to confront the possibility that our most basic tools for understanding reality, logic, evidence, confirmation, contain irreconcilable tensions. We've built our entire conception of knowledge on foundations that, when examined closely, reveal cracks that may run all the way to the bottom. Next time you confidently assert that the evidence supports your position, whether about climate change, vaccine efficacy, or which diet is healthiest, remember the Raven paradox. Your conception of what counts as evidence may itself be logically incoherent. The very notion of following the evidence becomes suspect when logic itself tells us that the evidence leads in directions our intuitions refuse to follow. The Raven paradox doesn't just challenge a specific scientific belief, it challenges the process by which we form all scientific beliefs. It suggests that at the deepest level, our methods for confirming hypotheses may be built on logical quicksand. And if that's true, can we truly claim to know anything at all? The arrow paradox. Ancient wisdom proves modern physics wrong. Motion is impossible. This isn't philosophy, it's mathematics. An arrow in flight cannot move. Not just unlikely, logically impossible. The proof has stood for 2,500 years, defying our most brilliant minds. What's truly terrifying? The solution requires abandoning what you thought was real about time, space, and motion itself. Zeno of Elea, a Greek philosopher from the 5th century BCE, devised a proof so disturbing that physicists and mathematicians are still grappling with its implications. His argument is brutally simple. At any instant, an arrow in flight occupies exactly one position in space, exactly its own length. But something occupying exactly one position isn't moving during that instant. If the arrow isn't moving at any single instant, and time consists entirely of instants, how can motion exist at all? This isn't wordplay, it's a fundamental paradox at the heart of reality. Every microsecond of time, the arrow occupies a single fixed position. Like a film strip composed of static frames, each moment of time captures the arrow in perfect stillness. Yet somehow these infinite moments of stillness supposedly create movement. This is mathematically absurd. Adding together any number of zeros always equals zero. Adding together infinitely many instants of stillness cannot logically produce motion. The implications shatter our understanding of reality. If motion is logically impossible, then your entire experience of a dynamic world is a profound illusion. Your perception of movement, of cars driving, people walking, planets orbiting, represents a fundamental failure of human cognition to perceive logical reality. Everything you've ever seen move is, according to rigorous logic, not actually moving at all. For centuries, intellectuals dismissed Zeno as engaged in mere sophistry, clever wordplay designed to confuse rather than illuminate. But here's the mind-bending revelation. No one has ever fully refuted Zeno's argument. Even with the full power of modern mathematics and physics, the paradox retains its disturbing force. The standard solutions don't actually solve the core paradox. They merely relocate it to different conceptual territory. The calculus approach suggests motion can be understood through limits and infinitesimals. But this doesn't address the fundamental paradox. It merely offers a mathematical language for describing movement while sidestepping the logical impossibility Zeno identified. Calculus describes motion without explaining how infinitely many moments of stillness can create movement. Quantum mechanics offers another potential escape, suggesting reality isn't continuous, but discrete at the smallest scales. Perhaps time and space come in minimum units, quantum pixels of reality. But this approach doesn't solve the paradox either. It merely changes the paradox's form. Even with discrete time steps, each moment still captures the arrow in a single position. The logical problem remains. What's truly disturbing is that the arrow paradox isn't alone. It's part of Zeno's quartet of paradoxes, each attacking motion from a different angle, each revealing a different aspect of the logical impossibility of movement. Together, they form an interlocking system of proofs that motion cannot exist, proofs that have withstood millennia of attempted refutation. Modern physics has been forced to adopt increasingly bizarre conceptions of reality to avoid Zeno's conclusion. Einstein's space-time unifies space and time into a single four-dimensional manifold where motion becomes an illusion. Objects don't move through space, they merely extend through space-time. This radical reconception of reality was partly motivated by paradoxes like Zeno's, which revealed fundamental problems with our intuitive understanding of motion. Some philosophers argue that the only true resolution lies in recognizing that time itself doesn't consist of instants. If time isn't made of indivisible moments but is fundamentally continuous in a way human cognition struggles to grasp, the paradox might dissolve. But this solution requires abandoning our most basic intuitions about time's nature, a cure that seems as disturbing as the disease. Digital physics, the theory that our universe is fundamentally computational, perhaps a simulation, faces the arrow paradox directly. How could a discrete computational system create the illusion of continuous motion? The paradox suggests that any digital simulation of our reality would need to somehow overcome this fundamental logical problem, or else reality itself cannot be what we think it is. What makes the arrow paradox especially unsettling is its simplicity. Unlike quantum mechanics or relativity, which require advanced mathematics to understand, Zeno's argument can be grasped by anyone. Its power comes not from complexity, but from exposing a fundamental contradiction in our most basic concepts. It suggests that motion, something we experience constantly, is logically impossible. Either our logic is fundamentally flawed, or our perception of reality is profoundly mistaken. The paradox connects to the foundations of mathematics itself. Georg Cantor's work on infinity and the continuum exposed similar paradoxes in our understanding of the infinite. The arrow paradox prefigured problems mathematicians would grapple with thousands of years later, problems that led to fundamental crises in mathematical foundations and eventually to Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which proved mathematics itself contains irresolvable paradoxes. The arrow paradox ultimately suggests something profoundly disturbing, that our cognitive apparatus evolved for practical survival, not for perceiving logical truth. Our minds construct a coherent experience of motion from what logic suggests must be a series of static states. If Zeno is right, then your most basic perceptions are fundamentally at odds with logical reality. Your mind isn't revealing the world, it's creating an illusory experience that better serves evolutionary fitness than logical truth. Next time you watch an arrow fly, a ball roll, or a person walk, remember, according to our most rigorous logic, none of this motion can possibly exist. Either our logic is wrong, our perception is wrong, or reality itself is far stranger than we can comprehend. Whichever answer you choose, the foundations of your understanding of the physical world will never be the same. The Bootstrap Paradox. You discover time travel and journey back to meet your favorite composer, only to find they never existed. Realizing history depends on this music existing, you publish the compositions you brought from the future under their name. The music now exists only because you brought it from a future where it existed because you brought it back. This information loop has no origin point, challenging our understanding of causality itself. The bootstrap paradox creates something from nothing. Information or objects that exist without ever being created. They're caught in a closed time loop, their existence perpetually feeding back on itself. The composer's work was never actually composed by anyone. It simply exists as an eternal loop in time, with no true point of origin. What makes this paradox so disturbing is that it violates our most fundamental understanding of cause and effect. We assume everything must have a beginning, a point of creation or origin. But the bootstrap paradox creates situations where effects generate their own causes, forming a circle of causation with no starting point. It's like a snake eating its own tail, existing in a logical impossibility. Consider another version. A scientist receives plans for a time machine from her future self, builds it, and then sends the plans back in time to her younger self. Who actually designed the time machine? No one. The plans exist in a causality loop without original creation, an informational artifact with no point of origin. This isn't just philosophical wordplay. The bootstrap paradox reveals potential contradictions in how we understand time and causality. If time travel to the past is possible, these paradoxes might be physically real, not just thought experiments. This presents a profound challenge to physics, which relies on cause preceding effect. Physicists take these paradoxes seriously enough that they've developed mathematical models to address them. Closed time-like curves, CTCs, are solutions to Einstein's field equations that allow for time loops. Quantum approaches suggest that paradoxes might resolve themselves by creating multiple timelines or through quantum mechanical constraints that prevent contradictions from arising. The bootstrap paradox appears throughout science fiction, from Doctor Who's Beethoven scenario to the film Interstellar, where future humans create the wormhole that allows them to exist. These stories aren't just entertainment, they explore genuine logical problems that time travel would create. Beyond time travel, the paradox connects to questions about information and existence. Where does information ultimately come from? Can information exist without being created? The paradox suggests the disturbing possibility that some things might simply exist in causal loops without true creation points, challenging our intuitive understanding of reality. The paradox becomes even more unsettling when applied to human existence. Imagine traveling back in time and through a series of events, becoming your own ancestor. You would exist only because you created the conditions for your own birth, a biological bootstrap paradox. Your DNA would exist in a causality loop, never truly created but merely perpetuated through time. Some philosophers suggest the paradox reveals fundamental limitations in human cognition, that our minds evolved to understand causality as linear, moving from past to future. The bootstrap paradox might not be a true contradiction in reality, but rather a breakdown in our cognitive ability to comprehend non-linear causation. Others argue that the paradox proves time travel to the past is physically impossible. If such journeys would create irresolvable paradoxes, perhaps the laws of physics simply forbid such travel. A principal physicist, Stephen Hawking, called the chronology protection conjecture, suggesting nature prevents time paradoxes by making time travel impossible. Regardless of physical possibility, the bootstrap paradox forces us to question our most basic assumptions about reality. We instinctively believe everything must have a beginning, that information, objects, and events can't exist without creation. The paradox challenges this intuition, suggesting the disturbing possibility of existence without origin. This connects to ancient philosophical questions. Theologians have long debated whether God exists outside time and causality. Some argue God represents an uncaused cause, a bootstrap-like entity existing without prior creation. The paradox has parallels in religious concepts of eternal existence without beginning. Information theorists suggest the paradox reveals something profound about information itself. Perhaps information isn't bound by the same causal rules as matter and energy. Information might be capable of existing in loops that transcend conventional causality, an unsettling possibility with implications for how we understand consciousness, which itself might be considered a form of information processing. The most mind-bending aspect of the bootstrap paradox is that if time travel exists, these causality loops might be happening constantly without our awareness. Our reality might be filled with information, objects, and events that exist without creation, their origins lost in the circular maze of time loops. When confronted with the bootstrap paradox, we face three uncomfortable possibilities. Time travel to the past is impossible, our understanding of causality is fundamentally flawed, or reality contains elements that simply exist without creation. Eternal artifacts caught in the loop of time itself. The bootstrap paradox ultimately forces us to confront the possibility that our most basic intuition about reality, that everything must come from somewhere, might be wrong. Some things might simply exist in eternal loops of self-causation, challenging our deepest assumptions about the nature of existence itself. NEWCOMB'S paradox. A being who can predict your choices with perfect accuracy gives you a choice that will shatter your concept of free will, rationality, and possibly reality itself. This isn't science fiction. It's a thought experiment that's divided the world's top philosophers for decades, with Nobel Prize-winning mathematicians on both sides. What's truly terrifying? Your answer reveals whether your entire decision-making process is fundamentally broken. Here's the scenario that will make you question everything you believe about choice. An entity, call it an advanced AI, a time traveler, or a super-intelligent alien, presents you with two boxes. Box A is transparent and contains $1,000. Box B is opaque and contains either $1 million or nothing. You can choose either Box B alone or both boxes together. But here's the mind-bending twist. The entity has already predicted your choice with perfect accuracy. If it predicted you'd take only Box B, it put $1 million inside. If it predicted you'd take both boxes, it left Box B empty. The entity has already made its prediction and filled or not filled the boxes before you choose. The entity has played this game thousands of times with others and has never been wrong. What would you choose? If you're like most people, your first instinct is to take both boxes. After all, the money is already placed. Box A definitely has $1,000. Box B either contains $1 million or nothing, regardless of what you choose now. So taking both boxes seems to guarantee you at least $1,000, with the possibility of $1,001,000. Taking only Box B risks getting nothing when you could have had at least $1,000. But this seemingly obvious logic collapses under scrutiny. Everyone who has taken both boxes has discovered Box B empty, walking away with just $1,000. Everyone who has taken only Box B has found the $1 million. Given the entity's perfect prediction record, choosing only Box B statistically guarantees you $1 million, while choosing both boxes guarantees you just $1,000. This paradox has fractured the foundations of decision theory. It pits two core principles of rational choice against each other in direct conflict. The principle of dominance says, when one option gives better results in all possible circumstances, you should choose it, suggesting you take both boxes. The principle of expected utility says you should choose the option with the best average outcome, suggesting you take only Box B. What makes this paradox so disturbing is that both sides can mathematically prove their answer is correct. Nobel Prize-winning mathematician and game theorist Robert Aumann has proven that taking both boxes is rational. Equally brilliant philosophers like David Lewis have proven that taking only Box B is rational. Both proofs use impeccable logic. Both cannot be right. Something fundamental in our understanding of rational choice must be broken. The implications reach far beyond a hypothetical game. NEWCOMB'S paradox challenges our most basic assumptions about causality, free will, and decision-making. If you choose only Box B believing the entity's prediction will match your choice, you're essentially believing your current decision can affect a past event, what the entity predicted and did. This seems to reverse causality itself, an effect preceding its cause. But if you insist causality can only flow forward and take both boxes, you're forced to accept a bizarre conclusion. The optimal decision procedure leads to predictably worse outcomes. You knowingly choose a strategy that leaves you with less money. This contradicts the very definition of rational choice. What's truly mind-boggling is what this reveals about free will. If the entity can perfectly predict your choice, was it really a choice at all? Your decision feels free from the inside, yet was predictable from the outside. This suggests a profoundly disturbing possibility. Your sense of making free choices might be an illusion, a deterministic process masquerading as free will. The paradox becomes even more unsettling when we consider real-world applications. Modern predictive algorithms increasingly anticipate human choices, from consumer purchases to voting patterns to criminal behavior. These predictions shape opportunities presented to you, creating Newcomb-like scenarios where your perceived choices are prejudged, the options already stacked based on predictions about what you'll choose. Some philosophers argue the paradox reveals that rationality itself contains an irreconcilable contradiction. Perhaps there is no single coherent concept of rational choice. What's rational depends on your perspective on causality, free will, and the nature of decision itself. This suggests our entire framework for understanding rational choice, the foundation of economics, ethics, and personal decision-making, might be fundamentally incoherent. Others see the paradox as evidence that our understanding of time and causality is profoundly mistaken. Perhaps information can flow backward in time in ways we don't comprehend. Quantum mechanics offers tantalizing hints of such possibilities, like the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, where a future measurement appears to influence a past event. The paradox also challenges our understanding of knowledge and prediction. If perfect prediction is possible even in principle, the universe must be either deterministic, no true free will exists, or contain mechanisms for backward causation, effects preceding causes. Either possibility shatters our conventional understanding of reality. What's most disturbing is what your own answer reveals about you. One-boxers, those who take only box B, effectively acknowledge that their decisions are predictable, their cherished sense of free choice partly an illusion. Two-boxers maintain their freedom of choice, but must accept that their decision-making systematically leads to worse outcomes, a Pyrrhic victory where freedom costs $999,000. Some philosophers suggest the paradox reveals that we're forced to choose between believing in free will and believing in rationality. We cannot coherently maintain both. Your answer exposes which principle you'll sacrifice when they conflict. The paradox has practical implications for artificial intelligence. As we build increasingly sophisticated AI systems, how should they handle Newcomb-like scenarios? Should they be programmed as one-boxers or two-boxers? This seemingly abstract puzzle becomes crucially important as we create entities that will make consequential decisions. The most unsettling interpretation sees Newcomb's paradox as a window into the simulation hypothesis. If we live in a simulation, the simulators could easily implement Newcomb-like scenarios, presenting choices while already knowing our decisions. Our reality could be filled with such predetermined choices, giving us the illusion of freedom, while our decisions were anticipated long before we made them. The next time you make what feels like a free choice, remember Newcomb's paradox. The entities predicting your behavior, from marketers to algorithms to governments, may have already anticipated your decision and structured your options accordingly. Your cherished sense of free choice might be more constrained and predictable than you've ever imagined. And the frameworks you use to make rational decisions might contain contradictions so fundamental that no perfectly rational choice exists. In a world increasingly driven by predictive algorithms, we all live in versions of Newcomb's paradox. The question isn't whether you'd take one box or two in a hypothetical scenario. It's whether the choices you make every day are truly choices at all. The liar paradox. This statement is false. 4 simple words that break logic itself, not just challenge it, completely shatter it. This isn't abstract philosophy, it's a fatal wound in human reasoning that philosophers, mathematicians, and linguists have tried to heal for 2,500 years and failed. What's truly terrifying? The implications reach far beyond word games, threatening to unravel everything from artificial intelligence to your own sense of truth. This statement is false. Take a moment to really consider it. If the statement is true, then it must be false, because that's what it claims. But if it's false, then its claim must be wrong, which means it must be true. Each possibility contradicts itself, creating an endless loop of paradox. Truth collapses into falsehood, falsehood into truth, in an infinite cycle that logic cannot escape. The ancient Greeks knew this paradox as the liar paradox, attributed to Epimenides of Crete, who supposedly stated, "All Cretans are liars." If true, then as a Cretan himself, he must be lying, making his statement false. But if he's lying, then his statement must be false, meaning not all Cretans are liars, potentially making his statement true again. The circularity destroys any stable concept of truth. What makes this paradox so disturbing is its simplicity. Unlike complex scientific or mathematical paradoxes, the liar paradox requires no special knowledge to understand. A child can grasp it. Yet this simple sentence has resisted resolution by the greatest minds in history. When a statement this basic breaks the fundamental laws of thought, it suggests something is profoundly wrong with how we understand truth and language. The paradox forces us to confront the possibility that our conceptual frameworks, the very tools we use to make sense of reality, contain irreconcilable contradictions at their core. If basic logical principles can't handle a four-word sentence without collapsing into contradiction, how can we trust them to guide our understanding of the universe, consciousness, or morality? Throughout history, thinkers have proposed solutions only to see them crumble under scrutiny. Some suggest such statements are neither true nor false, but meaningless. Yet they clearly have meaning. We understand exactly what this statement is false is claiming. Others propose that truth comes in levels or hierarchies, with statements unable to reference their own truth value. But this seems arbitrary, a desperate patch rather than a genuine solution. The paradox became even more threatening in the early 20th century, when similar self-referential paradoxes emerged in the foundations of mathematics. Bertrand Russell discovered a version involving sets that contain themselves, leading to the same logical explosion. Kurt Gödel later proved that any logical system powerful enough to express basic arithmetic must contain statements that cannot be proven true or false within the system, a devastating blow to the dream of perfect logical certainty. What's truly mind-bending is what this reveals about language and thought. Human language naturally allows self-reference. We can talk about talking, think about thinking, and make statements about statements. This seemingly innocent feature creates a crack in logic itself, a fundamental limitation built into any system that can refer to itself. The paradox suggests that complete logical consistency might be impossible for any system capable of self-reference, including human thought. The implications for artificial intelligence are particularly disturbing. As we build increasingly sophisticated AI systems, they inevitably encounter self-referential paradoxes. An AI asked to evaluate, "This statement is false," either crashes into infinite loops or requires arbitrary restrictions on its reasoning. The paradox reveals a fundamental limitation in logical systems that no amount of computational power can overcome. Our dreams of perfectly logical artificial minds may be fundamentally unattainable. Some philosophers argue the paradox reveals something profound about truth itself, that truth isn't a simple property statements either have or lack, but something more complex, contextual, and perhaps ultimately mysterious. The clean binary logic of true-false that underlies modern computing, science, and rational thought might be an oversimplification that breaks down at its own boundaries. The paradox connects to profound questions about consciousness and self-awareness. The ability to reflect on one's own thoughts, to make statements about one's own mental states, creates the possibility of paradoxical structures within consciousness itself. Perhaps the mind's ability to contemplate itself introduces inevitable contradictions into human thought, limitations that no thinking being can escape. Legal systems face their own versions of the liar paradox. Consider the self-referential law. Ignore this law. Should it be followed, in which case it must be ignored, or ignored, in which case it must be followed. Such paradoxes aren't merely theoretical. Real legal systems contain self-referential elements that create genuine puzzles for judges and legislators, undermining the dream of perfectly consistent legal codes. The paradox also undermines our understanding of language itself. If a simple sentence can create a situation where both possible truth values lead to contradiction, perhaps language isn't the perfect mirror of reality we imagine. Perhaps the very structure of language contains inherent limitations that prevent it from perfectly capturing truth. A disturbing prospect for any field built on precise verbal descriptions of reality. Some thinkers see the liar paradox as evidence that reality itself contains contradictions, that the law of non-contradiction, something cannot be both true and false simultaneously, might not be universal. Eastern philosophical traditions like Buddhism and Taoism have long embraced paradox and contradiction as features of reality rather than flaws in our understanding. Perhaps Western logical traditions have been pursuing an impossible dream of contradiction-free knowledge. The most unsettling interpretation suggests the paradox reveals fundamental limitations in human cognition itself. Perhaps our minds evolved for survival and reproduction in the physical world, not for perfect logical consistency. The paradox may expose the boundaries of thought itself, regions where human reason, despite all its power, simply cannot go without contradicting itself. Next time you confidently declare something true or false, remember the liar paradox. Remember that our most basic concepts of truth and falsehood harbor a paradox that 2,500 years of human genius hasn't resolved. The ground beneath our logical certainties may be less solid than we imagine, shot through with cracks that no amount of philosophical putty can fully repair. In a world increasingly divided between competing claims of truth and accusations of falsehood, the liar paradox whispers a disturbing possibility. Perhaps truth itself is more complex, more paradoxical, and more elusive than our binary thinking admits. Perhaps the boundaries between truth and falsehood are not the clear lines we pretend, but blurry borderlands where logic itself breaks down and certainty dissolves into paradox. The experience machine paradox. Would you plug into a machine that gives you perfect happiness? A device that stimulates your brain to create any experience you desire, love, success, pleasure, meaning, indistinguishable from reality. Most people instantly refuse. This seemingly simple choice shatters everything modern society teaches about happiness, desire, and the good life. What's truly terrifying is what your refusal reveals, that nearly everything you consciously pursue in life isn't what you actually value. Philosopher Robert Nozick proposed this thought experiment in 1974, and the results continue to haunt philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists. The experience machine offers everything people claim to want: pleasure, happiness, desire, satisfaction. Yet most people recoil from it. This dramatic contradiction between what we say we want and what we actually choose exposes a crisis at the heart of how we understand human motivation and value. Imagine the machine in vivid detail. It provides experiences far better than your best days, more intense pleasure, deeper relationships, greater achievements. You could be a celebrated artist, a beloved leader, an athletic champion. You could experience perfect love, profound spiritual enlightenment, or intellectual breakthroughs. The machine's neural stimulation makes these experiences indistinguishable from reality. While connected, you'd have no awareness you're in a machine. The experiences would feel completely real. The machine's programmers offer you a lifetime subscription. Once connected, you'll live out your days in this simulated perfection. Your physical body will be maintained, but your consciousness will forever dwell in the simulation. You'll experience the life of your dreams, with no awareness it isn't real. Would you connect? If you're like most people, something within you resists. But why? The machine offers everything conventional wisdom says we want. If happiness, pleasure, and desire satisfaction are what matter, connecting is the obvious choice. Your reluctance reveals something profound. These conscious pursuits aren't what you truly value. What makes this paradox so unsettling is how it undermines the foundations of multiple philosophical traditions. Hedonism claims pleasure is the ultimate good. Yet the experience machine offers maximum pleasure, and we reject it. Desire satisfaction theories suggest fulfilling our wants is what matters. Yet the machine satisfies all desires, and still we refuse. Even subjective accounts of well-being, claiming that feeling happy is what counts, fall before our intuitive rejection of the machine. The paradox exposes a profound contradiction between our stated values and our actual values. We claim to pursue happiness, pleasure, success, and achievement, yet when offered these in perfect form, we refuse. This suggests we value something else entirely, something many of us struggle to articulate but intuitively understand: reality itself, genuine connection, authentic accomplishment. What's particularly disturbing is how this challenges modern culture's happiness obsession. Our society relentlessly promotes the pursuit of happiness and positive experiences. Self-help books, wellness influencers, and mindfulness apps promise to maximize your positive emotions. The experience machine reveals this entire enterprise may be fundamentally misguided, that humans value something beyond subjective experience, something the happiness industry ignores. The paradox becomes even more unsettling when we consider modern technology. Social media platforms, immersive video games, virtual reality, and eventually brain-computer interfaces are all creating increasingly convincing experience machines. Each technology iteration brings us closer to Nozick's thought experiment. Our intuitive rejection of the hypothetical machine raises disturbing questions about the trajectory of technological development. Are we building a future we'll ultimately find empty? Some philosophers suggest our aversion to the machine stems from evolutionary programming rather than deeper wisdom. Perhaps we evolved to value reality because, throughout evolutionary history, losing touch with reality meant death. Our intuitive preference for reality might be an evolutionary artifact rather than a revelation of deeper truth. This interpretation suggests our rejection of the experience machine might itself be irrational, a biological bias rather than philosophical insight. But others see our reluctance as revealing something profound about human nature. Perhaps we are not merely experience-seeking creatures but reality-seeking ones. We want not just the feeling of accomplishment but actual accomplishment, not just the appearance of connection, but genuine connection. This interpretation suggests that contact with reality, even painful reality, is a core human value that no simulation, however perfect, can satisfy. The paradox becomes even more complex when we consider religious perspectives. Many religious traditions distinguish between false pleasures and true happiness, between illusory contentment and genuine fulfillment. These traditions might see our rejection of the experience machine as confirming ancient wisdom, that human flourishing requires engagement with reality, not retreat into pleasant illusion. Yet these same traditions often promise heavenly rewards that sound suspiciously like their own versions of experience machines. The most disturbing interpretation suggests the paradox reveals a fundamental incoherence in human values. Perhaps we're caught between competing drives, one toward pleasure and happiness, another toward reality and authenticity, with no way to fully reconcile them. This would mean human existence involves an irresolvable tension between what feels good and what feels real, a tension no life philosophy can fully resolve. The experience machine forces us to confront unsettling questions about ongoing technological developments. Virtual reality, augmented reality, and social media already offer partial experience machines. If these technologies eventually approach the immersiveness of Nozick's machine, will we resist them as we claim we would resist the philosophical thought experiment? Or will we gradually surrender to increasingly convincing simulations, embracing what we claim to reject? The paradox also raises profound questions about mental health and psychopharmacology. Medications that alleviate depression or anxiety essentially modify our subjective experience, often without changing external reality. The experience machine paradox forces us to consider: is there a principled difference between taking mood-altering medications and connecting to Nozick's machine? Where do we draw the line between therapeutic intervention and problematic reality avoidance? Some contemporary philosophers have challenged Nozick's conclusions, arguing that our reluctance stems from practical concerns rather than deeper wisdom. Perhaps we worry the machine would malfunction, or that programmers would abuse their power. But these objections miss the point. The thought experiment stipulates a perfectly functioning, permanent connection. Our hesitation persists even when these practical concerns are eliminated. The paradox connects deeply to the philosophy of meaning. If we reject the experience machine despite its perfect happiness, we're suggesting that meaning requires something beyond positive mental states. Perhaps meaning requires genuine connection to reality, actual accomplishment rather than simulated success, authentic relationships rather than programmed interactions. This suggests that the modern pursuit of happiness might be fundamentally misguided. That meaning, not happiness, is what humans ultimately seek. Brain imaging studies offer tantalizing insights into the paradox. When people experience genuine social connection versus simulated interaction, different neural pathways activate. Our brains seem to distinguish between authentic and artificial experiences, even when consciously we cannot tell the difference. This suggests our rejection of the experience machine might reflect deep neural wisdom rather than cultural conditioning. The paradox becomes particularly relevant when considering mental illness. Conditions like depression often involve painful but accurate perceptions of reality. Should treatment aim to restore accurate perception, even if painful, or promote subjective well-being, even at the cost of some self-deception? The experience machine paradox suggests these questions have no easy answers, that the tension between reality orientation and happiness orientation extends into psychiatric ethics. The most profound implication may be what the paradox reveals about consciousness itself. Perhaps consciousness evolved not merely to generate pleasant experiences, but to connect us accurately to reality. Our rejection of the experience machine might reflect the fundamental purpose of consciousness, not to make us feel good, but to help us navigate actual reality, with all its pain and limitation. Next time you scroll through social media seeking validation, binge Netflix to escape your life, or fantasize about a perfect future, remember the experience machine. Remember that your conscious pursuit of pleasant experiences conflicts with your deeper values. The happiness and pleasure you think you're seeking aren't what you truly want. What you actually value, reality, authenticity, genuine connection, may be harder to articulate but forms the true foundation of a meaningful human life. The mere addition paradox. Which world is better? One with 10 billion people living lives barely worth living, or 1 billion people living in bliss? Through a series of seemingly reasonable steps, philosophers have shown that logic leads us to conclude the overcrowded, barely happy world is better. This disturbing result challenges everything we believe about ethics and how we should value human life. Imagine a world called A, with 1 billion people all living extremely happy, fulfilling lives. Most would agree this is a good world. Now imagine we add another 1 billion people to create world A+. These additional people have lives that are less happy than the original population, but still worth living. They don't negatively affect the original population's happiness. Surely adding more happy lives makes the world better, or at least not worse, right? Now consider another world B, where everyone, all 2 billion people, has the same moderate level of happiness, higher than the added population in A+, but lower than the original population. The total happiness in B might be greater than in A+, since the loss of happiness for the original billion is outweighed by the gain for the second billion. Many would agree B is better than A+. Let's continue this process. We can create world C with 4 billion people at a lower level of happiness, but with more total happiness than B. Then world D with 8 billion people at an even lower level of happiness, but again with more total happiness. And so on, until we reach world Z, a vastly overcrowded planet with trillions of people whose lives are just barely worth living, containing only the smallest positive experiences and almost nothing we would recognize as human flourishing. This sequence of comparisons leads us to the repugnant conclusion. World Z, with its vast population living lives barely worth living, is better than World A with its smaller population living in bliss. This deeply counterintuitive result emerges from three seemingly reasonable principles. 1. Adding happy lives to a population is never bad. 2. Equally distributing happiness across a population doesn't make things worse. And 3. A larger total amount of happiness is better than a smaller amount. This paradox was first identified by philosopher Derek Parfit in 1984, and it has troubled ethicists ever since. The steps in the argument seem individually reasonable, yet they lead to a conclusion most find morally repugnant. Who would choose a world where trillions live in near misery over one where billions live in joy? The paradox cuts to the heart of population ethics, the branch of philosophy concerned with moral questions about creating new people. It exposes tensions between different ways of valuing populations. Should we maximize total happiness, total utilitarianism? Average happiness, average utilitarianism? Or something else entirely? Total utilitarianism leads directly to the repugnant conclusion. If what matters is the sum of happiness across all people, then World Z is indeed better than World A, because the vast number of people compensates for their barely worth living lives. But this seems to reduce humans to mere happiness containers, where quantity can always trump quality of life. Average utilitarianism avoids this particular trap, but creates others. If we should maximize average happiness, then a world with a single ecstatically happy person would be better than a world with billions of extremely happy people, plus one slightly less happy person, since the latter would lower the average. This too seems wrong. Some philosophers have tried to escape the paradox by rejecting one of the seemingly reasonable steps. Perhaps adding happy lives isn't always good. Perhaps equality of distribution isn't always preferable. Perhaps total happiness isn't what matters most. But each of these moves comes with its own counterintuitive implications. One approach is to adopt a critical level view, where adding a new life only improves the world if that life reaches a certain threshold of happiness well above the barely worth living level. This avoids the repugnant conclusion, but introduces new problems. It implies that adding lives below but still above the zero level actually makes the world worse, which seems harsh toward people with modest but positive well-being. Another approach suggests that certain valuable experiences, like artistic achievement, deep relationships, or intellectual discovery, cannot be outweighed by any amount of minor pleasures. On this view, World A contains qualitatively different goods than World Z, making straightforward comparison impossible. But this requires abandoning the intuitive idea that happiness can be measured on a single scale. Some philosophers bite the bullet and accept the repugnant conclusion, arguing that our intuitive rejection of World Z stems from failures of imagination. Perhaps we underestimate how many lives barely worth living would equal one excellent life. Or perhaps we're biased toward quality over quantity in ways that don't stand up to ethical scrutiny. What makes the mere addition paradox particularly troubling is its real-world implications. We face actual choices about population size and quality of life. Should we aim for smaller populations with higher standards of living, or larger populations with more modest lives? Should we bring children into existence even if their lives will contain significant suffering along with joy? Current policies on environmental protection, reproductive rights, and resource distribution all implicitly take positions on these questions. Climate change makes the paradox especially relevant. Some argue that preventing climate catastrophe requires limiting population growth. Others suggest technological solutions could support larger populations sustainably. The mere addition paradox forces us to consider what kind of future world we should aim for. One with fewer people living better lives, or more people living more modest lives. The paradox also connects to questions about extinction risk. If we accept that adding happy lives is good, then preventing human extinction becomes morally urgent, as extinction would prevent countless potential future people from existing. But if those future lives would be barely worth living due to resource constraints or environmental degradation, the repugnant conclusion suggests this might still be better than a smaller, happier population. This creates difficult questions about how much current generations should sacrifice for potential future people. Transhumanist technologies raise further complications. If we could dramatically enhance human happiness through genetic engineering or brain-computer interfaces, should we prefer a smaller population of enhanced humans or a larger population of unenhanced ones? The mere addition paradox suggests that simply adding more moderately happy people might be better than creating fewer extraordinarily happy ones. Some philosophers see the paradox as revealing a fundamental limitation in consequentialist ethical frameworks that focus exclusively on outcomes. Perhaps what matters isn't just the resulting state of the world, but how we get there, and the rights and responsibilities we have along the way. This moves the discussion toward deontological ethics, focused on duties and rights rather than just consequences. Others suggest that the paradox reveals something about the structure of value itself. Perhaps value isn't simply additive. Doubling the population doesn't simply double the value, even if individual happiness levels remain constant. This leads to complex mathematical models of population ethics that try to capture our intuitions more accurately than simple addition. The mere addition paradox also connects to questions about personal identity and existence. Is it better for a person to exist with a life barely worth living than not to exist at all? This question becomes especially difficult when we consider that non-existence isn't bad for anyone. There's no one who experiences the deprivation of not being brought into existence. Perhaps the deepest lesson of the paradox is that our moral intuitions about population ethics are inconsistent. We want to value both the quality and quantity of lives, both total and average well-being, both the happiness of individuals and the overall state of society. But the mere addition paradox shows that these values can come into conflict in ways that force difficult trade-offs. So which would you choose? A world with 1 billion people living in bliss, or a world with trillions living lives just barely worth living? Your answer reveals something profound about your values, about whether you prioritize the intensity of individual experiences or the total amount of positive experience in the world. It forces you to consider whether mere addition of happy lives is always good, and whether there's more to human flourishing than just the quantity of happiness. The mere addition paradox doesn't just challenge our thinking about hypothetical future populations. It forces us to reconsider our most basic assumptions about what makes a life valuable and what makes a world good. It reveals that even seemingly reasonable ethical principles can lead to conclusions that conflict with our deepest moral intuitions, leaving us with the difficult task of revising either our principles or our intuitions. Perhaps there is no perfect solution to this paradox, no way to fully reconcile our conflicting values about population ethics. If so, the repugnant conclusion stands as a humbling reminder of the limitations of human moral reasoning and the complex ethical challenges we face as we shape the future of our species and our planet.